Hello everyone, welcome to Frightening Tales. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax and dive into tonight's case. Today I told you about celebrity deaths that rocked Hollywood and the world. There was a time, not really all that long ago, when celebrity was a byproduct, a side effect if you will, of greatness. If a person was exceptional, unique, different, then the interest of a captivated nation, even the whole world, naturally followed their every move. Robin Williams's manic humor made us laugh harder and longer than we thought possible, while his brilliant dramatic roles quietened us, as he reached inside and occupied the very essence of our humanity. Whitney Houston took our breath away with her powerhouse vocals. Marilyn Monroe was so angelically beautiful she almost seemed unreal, while her charm and poise was equally dreamlike. Even among giants, these men and women were titans, and we could not take our eyes off of them, nor did we want to. They were the best, and we couldn't help but admire, respect and stand in awe of them. They were truly, inescapably, ineffably great. Today things are a little different. Now, with the advent of reality programming and 24-hour on-demand entertainment, plenty of people are famous just for being famous. A condition that would boggle the mind if one was to make the mistake of pondering it for any length of time. In the pages that follow, we will deal exclusively with unbelievably great men and women who, for reasons all their own and often, sadly, entirely beyond their control, left us too soon. But with the great and the ordinary alike, and while celebrity almost always carries with it the fortune and status which allows a star to do virtually anything they can dream of, it does not, necessarily, go hand in hand with it happiness or fulfillment. It is certainly not an inoculation against depression, errors in judgment, or any of the many, many attendant difficulties of just being alive, a condition that is both all too fleeting and very, very fragile. In fact, not only is being celebrated for our gifts not a vaccine, for many of the greatest men and women to ever walk this little blue dot we all call home, fame was the very disease that took their lives. It was everything they wanted, and it killed them. Everybody dies. Some people die suddenly with too many things left undone. Some of us, a very few of us, burn so brightly while we are alive that, when our light is extinguished, it leaves the universe a much darker place. The men and women we will discuss in these pages were all stars. They were each of them a sun. They warmed us and they lit our way. Tragically, all of their lights were extinguished far too soon, leaving us all a little colder and wondering one single but very hard question: why? Why, with all of that money, all of the privilege, and all of the love they must have felt from millions and millions of adoring fans, why would some choose to live life so recklessly? We may never know the answer to a question as simple and yet as complex as why, but we can investigate. We can celebrate them for who they were and not what they did. While searching for answers to the questions surrounding their deaths, we can also elevate their lives, give them meaning. We can remember the joy they gave to us freely and the wisdom they imparted in whatever short, but brilliant time they were here. We can remember that while death is always horrible and young death a tragedy, unlike any other, the true measure of life is not defined by time, it is by the effect a person had on us, and in the legacy they left behind. As we mourn the passing of those who touched us, and whose influence will continue to shape us for generations to come, we can remember that for each of us, life is just a little More bearable, because they were here. Heath Ledger couldn't sleep. Heath Andrew Ledger was born April 4, 1979 in Perth, Australia, a place he would later describe as the most isolated city in the world. But from that place of isolation came a juggernaut of talent. Ledger's mother, Sally, and his father, Kim, named their son after Heathcliff, the protagonist of Emily Bronte's celebrated 1847 novel Wuthering Heights. The Heathcliff of literary fame is commonly seen as an archetypical romantic hero, a tortured, haunted man whose passions ultimately destroy him, a description that, tragically, could likely apply to his flesh and blood namesake, as well. Whether that fact is prophecy or irony is unknowable, what is clear is that it is terrible. Bright and multi-talented from an extremely early age, Ledger was obsessed with movie musicals as a child and won the Western Australian Junior Chess Championship at the age of 10. That same year he decided to try acting for the first time. He played the lead role of the boy who wouldn't grow up in a community theater production of J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan, and at that moment his life's trajectory was set, though he didn't yet know it. At just 16, Ledger sat for his early graduation exams and almost immediately afterward jumped in a car with his friend, Trevor DiCarlo, and drove 3,291 kilometers across the great expanse of Australia to Sydney, to begin his career in earnest. Success didn't wait long to find the young actor as he landed role after role in film and television, including a turn starring opposite Kerry Russell, Felicity, The Americans, in the medieval warrior drama Roar on the Fox network. Shortly thereafter, he starred as a rebellious, hunky teenager in the surprise hit 10 Things I Hate About You, and he was truly off to the races, lighting up the silver screen in blockbusters, one after another. Already on a rocket ride, 2004 would see Ledger's life forever changed when he took on the role of Ennis Del Mar, a rugged, repressed, homosexual cowboy in Ang Lee's Brokeback Mountain. That film would see his performance nominated for just about every award known to man and, more importantly, would introduce Ledger to a young actress named Michelle Williams. Ledger and Williams fell in love on the first day of shooting, somewhere around the fifth take, while tobogganing down a steep hill. In May of that same year, the young couple announced they were expecting a baby girl and moved into a brownstone in Brooklyn, New York. With the arrival of his daughter, Matilda Rose, Ledger threw himself into fatherhood with the same gusto that had previously seemed reserved solely for his work. In fact, he put his career on hold for an entire year, just to be a dad. He told the Boston Globe, "I'm Mr. Mom. I get Michelle granola and cook her an egg, I clean the dishes, and then I'm cooking lunch. Later, I go out to the market and get fresh produce for dinner. And I love it. I love my new job." Sadly, while from the outside absolutely everything seemed to be coming up roses, Ledger is said to have been deeply uncomfortable with the newly intensified attention he was receiving as a result of his numerous nominations, including both Golden Globe and Oscar nods. He had moved into a rarefied air of celebrity that, even amongst movie stars, is uncommon and, for many, uncomfortable. At the Sydney premiere of Brokeback Mountain, reporters actually fired water pistols at Ledger and his paramour, just the latest act of aggression in an ongoing battle between the star and the Australian press. 2 weeks later, while Ledger was attending an after-party at the Screen Actors Guild Awards, where he was again nominated, a video came to light. Routinely called shocking and harrowing by the domestic and international press, the video allegedly showed Ledger doing cocaine at a party and admitting to formerly smoking 5 marijuana cigarettes a day. Ledger's publicist quickly killed the video. Those who saw it seemed to form a consensus that the atmosphere of the event was not devil-may-care rowdiness, but the chilling disquiet of a man struggling to deal with his newfound status in a world that, perhaps, wanted more from him than he was able give. A friend of Ledger's recounted to New York Magazine that the day after the Oscars Ledger had been terribly anxious at one point, saying, "I'll never make another good film again. If this constant state of madness, pressure and expectations were what came with making great cinema, maybe the whole thing was better left avoided." And he just couldn't sleep. Every night, his body would be exhausted and begging for rest, but his mind could not, or would not, stop spinning. Insomnia is a terribly common affliction amongst the great, and the Australian superstar was no exception. A little over a year later, after what seemed to be an endless, agonizing awards season, Heath Ledger and Michelle Williams split, and he still couldn't sleep. Heath would not live to see the premiere of The Dark Knight, the record-shattering film, for which he gave, perhaps, his most electric and terrifyingly powerful performance, and for which he would win his first and only Academy Award. Ledger's final few days are known only in a potpourri of vague, contradictory, and often sketchy, paid-for accounts. He was in the process of shooting what would become his last film, The Imaginarium of Dr. Parnassus, under the directorship of Monty Python's Terry Gilliam. He was on too many airplanes, missing his daughter and unable or unwilling to hide his insomnia and stress. A co-star, recalling the long, rain-soaked nights of the Imaginarium shoot, diagnosed him as having caught a case of pneumonia that he didn't properly care for, which was stacked up against a growing array of other afflictions, anxiety, pain, drug addiction, and/or drug withdrawal. What we do know is that on his last night on Earth he was alone and most likely still not finding the sleep he so desired and needed. On January 22, 2008, he was found unconscious in his bed in his Soho apartment. At 3:36 p.m. he was pronounced dead. He was 28 years old. The official report from the office of New York's chief medical examiner declared, Mr. Heath Ledger died as the result of acute intoxication from the combined effects of oxycodone, hydrocodone, diazepam, temazepam, alprazolam, and doxylamine. We have concluded that the manner of death is accidental, resulting from the abuse of prescription medications. That list adds up to 2 tranquilizers, 2 painkillers, and 2 sleeping pills. In the aftermath of his tragic death, information, misinformation, and outright lies were everywhere, as a shocked public tried to come to terms with the loss of one of its brightest stars. He most certainly had more genius and humanity to share with us. His passing came just a few months before a scheduled charity trip to Africa, where he was slated to speak out against illegal poaching. In the end, many of the facts finally surfaced while any answers seemed to remain remarkably elusive. What we know is that we are better for having experienced his work. What we can hope for is that, at last, he can finally sleep. James Dean, living fast and dying young. James Byron Dean was born in Marion, Indiana on February 8, 1931. In his short life, he would star in only 3 films. This proved to be more than enough for him to become, perhaps, the single most potent and durable embodiment of American youth and irresistible cool the world has ever or will ever know. Dean grew up on a farm, cleaning barns and feeding chickens, an image somewhat contrary to the popular view of the lonely, distinctly urban actor. Interestingly and fittingly for a man so iconically American, though, Dean's father was a Quaker whose ancestors are believed to have arrived on the Mayflower. Also, somewhat oddly for someone often described as living a wanderer's life. Like a stray animal, is that, for a time, he studied law in college before changing his focus to theater. From UCLA he moved to New York City where he was accepted into the actor's studio to learn his craft from the legendary Lee Strasberg, who would shepherd the talents of so many of Hollywood's greatest stars, including Marilyn Monroe. After finding success on stage, as well as television, Dean caught the eye of some of Tinseltown's biggest names and in 1954 made his way back to California to star in his first major role. It was in the adaptation of John Steinbeck's novel, East of Eden, under the direction of the famed Elia Kazan. Horribly, though, he would not live long enough to learn that he was nominated for an Academy Award for his work on the film, making him the first actor to ever be nominated for an Oscar posthumously. Though was his work on his next major motion picture that would immortalize the young actor and permanently place him in the highest order of cultural icons. He starred as Jim Stark, a tortured American teenager in Rebel Without a Cause. His performance would set the tone for at least one generation of young men and women and become, perhaps, the single most defining image of the very idea of being a teen. His next and final role was starring opposite a pair of screen legends, Elizabeth Taylor and Rock Hudson, for the film Giant. Dean would also be nominated for an Academy Award for his work in this picture, making him the only person in history to earn multiple Acting Academy Award nominations after their death. It was this passion for acting that will allow him to live forever in the hearts and minds of movie lovers. Yet, at just 24 years old, it was his other major passion that would take him to an untimely end. Almost shockingly for this book, it wasn't an addiction to drugs and or alcohol that took the brilliant young man's life, it was an entirely different addiction, speed. If James Dean wasn't on a film set, he was behind the wheel of a racing car. He fell in love with auto racing at a very young age and never let go, becoming a professional driver in his spare time. His love of the sport was so ever-present he was routinely banned from the driving while filming, as producers feared the possible consequences Dean's addiction. On September 30, 1955, Dean and Rolf Wutherich, his trusted mechanic, were driving Dean's brand new and incredibly gorgeous Porsche 550 Spyder to a race in Salinas, California. At 3:30 p.m., the pair were pulled over by a police officer a little south of Bakersfield. The young superstar signed the last autograph of his life on a speeding ticket. Soon after, while cruising down Route 466, a young man named Donald Turnipseed swerved his car unexpectedly into Dean's path. The collision flipped the Porsche into the air and James Dean was instantly killed. Some reports say that Dean was traveling at more than twice the posted speed limit while others maintain he was traveling as little as 20 miles an hour faster than was suggested. While the tragic events of that day can surely be chalked up to a freak accident and not intentional recklessness, a similar argument could be made for his addiction to speed as could be made for other stars' addictions to drugs and alcohol. Or maybe James Dean was killed by a cursed car. It may sound ridiculous, but there is compelling evidence to suggest that his car was, well, evil. James Dean's Spyder was custom built by Hollywood automobile legend George Barris, who built, among many other iconic cars, the Batmobile from the 1966 Adam West Batman television show, and the brilliant, beautiful talking car Kid from Knight Rider. When Barris had completed his customization of Dean's car, the gorgeous Spyder was given a name, Little Bastard. The name came from an insult once hurled at James Dean from none other than Jack Warner himself, he of Warner Brothers fame. One of the most famous stories in Hollywood's history followed. It is said that on the 23rd of September, not long before the terrible accident that took his life, James Dean met celebrated movie star Sir Alec Guinness. Among other things, he was Obi-Wan Kenobi in the original Star Wars pictures, outside the famed Los Angeles restaurant Villa Capri, and asked him what he thought of his brand new Porsche, bragging it could top 150 miles per hour. Sir Guinness took in the speedster and quickly looked back at Dean. Guinness told the young star that the car was sinister and went on to say, "If you get in that car, you will be found dead in it by this time next week." The crash that killed the rebel without a cause took place exactly 7 days later. That story in itself is surely spooky enough, but it comes nowhere close to revealing the full extent of the darkness that attached itself to that car. George Barris purchased what little was left of the twisted little bastard for $2,500, and, only a few days later, while he was transporting it, the car somehow slipped loose of its trailer, rolled away, and crushed a mechanic's leg. Barris then broke the car down for spare parts and sold them to other racers. The engine went to a man named Troy McHenry, while the drivetrain found a home with William Eschrod. Shortly afterward, when McHenry and Eschrod faced off against each other in a race, both with pieces of the little bastard inside of their cars, McHenry lost control of his automobile, careened off of the track and struck a tree, killing him instantly. Later, during that same race, Eschrod's wheels freakishly locked up, going into a turn, causing his entire car to flip, which, luckily, did not kill Eschrod, but did leave him with serious injuries. Next, 2 tires from the little bastard were sold to a single client. While driving, both tires blew out at the exact same time, sending the driver careering off the road, thankfully without serious injury. What remained of the car at this point was in Barris's shop. 2 opportunistic thieves learned that the famous car was there, and they broke into the shop, looking for some ghoulish souvenirs. While one of the robbers tried to take the steering wheel, he somehow managed to receive massive lacerations to his arm, courtesy of the little bastard. The second thief tried to get one of the custom tartan seats, and he, too, managed to injure himself quite badly in the process. Crazy, right? Well, it doesn't stop there. After all of these macabre goings-on, Barris hid the car away where he hoped it could do no more harm, but the California Highway Patrol convinced him to let them use the famous automobile in an exhibit to encourage highway safety. Hoping that some good could come from all of the tragedy, Barris agreed to provide the car for a well-intentioned cause. The garage, which the Highway Patrol used to store Little Bastard prior to the exhibition, caught fire and burned to the ground, though the spider itself was somehow left virtually untouched by the flames. The police next displayed the car at a local high school to teach road safety lessons to the kids. The car somehow fell off of its display and crushed a high school student's hip. The Highway Patrol tried to take the cursed speedster to another event when the truck carrying Little Bastard mysteriously lost control. The driver of the truck was thrown from the cab, struck by Little Bastard and killed. The spider managed to fall off 2 more transportation trucks in the next few days, thankfully without injury, but it seems the Highway Patrol was through dealing with the evil machine. They told Barris he could have it back, but as the car was being transported to its owner, it mysteriously disappeared. No one has seen Little Bastard since. Was it a need for speed that killed James Dean? Was it a freak accident? Was it a cursed Porsche? Who knows? Tragic and awful is, perhaps, all we can say. For sure. Only a month before the accident, Dean had filmed a public safety television spot encouraging young men and women to drive responsibly. In the ad, Dean is asked, "Do you have any special advice for young people who drive?" And Dean answered with, "Take it easy driving. The life you save might be mine." James Dean had very little time on earth with which to make his mark, but the mark he made will likely never fade, such was his talent and his charisma. Dean once responded to press criticism that he was too short by saying, "How can you measure acting in inches? I would also ask, how can you measure greatness in years?" He was given far too few of those years, of course, and that is a great loss for all of us. But what is much more important are the gifts he shared while he could. There is still controversy to this day as to who was even driving Dean's car. Was it him or the mechanic? There is speculation he was driving slower than people thought, and in the end it was just a freak accident. All we really know is Dean's life was taken before he had a chance to show the world what he could really do. Whitney Houston, Thunder and Pain. Whitney Elizabeth Houston was surrounded by greatness from the moment she was born in August of 1963. Fame was her birthright. Her mother, Cissy Houston, and her cousin, Dionne Warwick, were already immensely successful, celebrated soul and gospel singers, which would have mattered a great deal. Except both were moons compared to the supernova that was her godmother, Aretha Franklin. Whitney began singing at a very young age in her mother's choir at New Hope Baptist Church to a dumbstruck congregation who seemed to believe wholeheartedly that the young girl's already booming voice was a gift from God. While her incredible vocals were her loudest talent, her quiet, natural beauty was almost as difficult to ignore. By the time she was a teenager, she was one of the most sought-after young models in the world, and among the very first African American women to ever appear on the cover of 17 magazine. But singing was always Houston's first passion, and it had an almost unstoppable quality. By 20 she was belting out tunes on national television, appearing on the Merv Griffin Show. By 22 she was a pop sensation with a debut album that spawned a Grammy, for the hit single Saving All My Love for You, and songs that spent 14 non-consecutive weeks in the #1 spot. Her first record was an achievement of epic proportions, perhaps matched only by the success of her second album, Whitney, released in 1987, which would be certified platinum multiple times, sold in astonishing 19 million copies worldwide, and made Houston the first female artist to ever debut at #1 on the US Billboard album chart. At only 24 years old, Whitney Houston was a juggernaut. She embarked on a world tour, sang to none other than the legendary South African President and revolutionary Nelson Mandela for his birthday. She also founded the Whitney Houston Foundation for Children, a charitable organization funding a variety of projects dedicated to helping children in need all over the world. As if all of this weren't enough, in 1992 she did something almost no recording artist had, or has, ever pulled off. She made a successful movie when she teamed up with superstar Kevin Costner for the very well-received film, The Bodyguard. Admittedly, Houston didn't stray too far from her comfort zone, as she played a pop star in the picture, but the movie was an enormous hit. The success of the film, however, was utterly dwarfed by the success of Houston's cover of the song I Will Always Love You, which was recorded for the soundtrack. That song went on to become the second best-selling single in history, only outdone by Elton John's tribute to Princess Diana, and cemented Houston's place as a figure of legend. She truly seemed like an unstoppable force until she met an immovable object named Bobby Brown, and, much worse, another unstoppable force of nature called cocaine. Brown and Houston were married the same year that The Bodyguard premiered. And a relationship that began as a passionate, loving affair, slowly dissolved into a very tumultuous situation as the years went on. The two performers turned out to be a volatile mixture, both hounded and hobbled by substance abuse. By the late 1990s, the toxic combination of her marriage and her addictions threatened Houston's health and badly damaged her career. She was forced to cancel multiple concerts over the next few years, and a television interview with ABC's Diane Sawyer, during which she looked emaciated and seemed ill, concerned many of her friends and fans, who worried openly that the star was nearing a nervous breakdown. During the interview, Houston hinted that she had been struggling with cocaine, prescription pills and marijuana before launching into a troubling speech about crack cocaine. First of all, she told Ms. Sawyer, "Let's get one thing straight. Crack is cheap. I make too much money to ever smoke crack." In that same interview, when asked where she'd like to be 10 years later, in 2012, Houston answered, "Retired. Sitting, looking at my daughter growing up. Having become a great woman of God, and enjoying my grandchildren." Tragically, she would die less than 2 months into the very year she'd been asked to project her hopes upon, 2012. Whitney would spend almost a decade trying to repair both her marriage and her career, both with little success. Despite these continuing struggles both personally and professionally, she was still, in 2006, officially named the most prolific female artist, in terms of awards, of all time by the Guinness Book of World Records. Success is not a cure for disease, and neither are awards, and Houston's struggle with addiction could still not be one. After a number of relapses, Houston's mother, with the aid of the Los Angeles County Sheriff, stepped in. Sissy Houston explained that she had received a court injunction, and demanded that her daughter get treatment and retire, telling Whitney that fame was simply not worth all of this. Whitney listened to her mother, took some time off, divorced Bobby Brown, and recovered to the point that, in 2007, she was granted sole custody of her daughter, Bobby Christina Houston Brown. The comeback of one of the greatest singing talents the world had ever seen seemed to be just a matter of time. But time was not on Houston's side. On February 11, 2012, she was found dead in her bathtub at only 48 years old. The official autopsy from the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office named the official cause of death by accidental drowning, before going on to detail the terrible role drugs played in her death. Had she been alert and sober, this tragedy would almost certainly have never occurred. The report further said that found in Houston's hotel were a small spoon with a white crystal-like substance in it, as well as a mirror upon which was an unidentified powder, along with 12 separate prescription medicines as prescribed by no fewer than 5 separate doctors. The report also said that Houston had developed a hole in her nasal septum, a result of prolonged cocaine use, and that she wore dentures, her teeth, presumably, also having fallen victim to chronic drug abuse. She had a voice like thunder, like nothing we had ever heard before, and like nothing we will ever hear again. It made her great, her greatness made her famous, but fame, quite literally, tore a hole in her. The Romans had a saying just for this phenomenon: quod me nutrit me destruit, meaning that which nourishes me, destroys me. Her story is heartbreaking, challenging, and horribly familiar. Whitney Houston's passing leaves us missing the woman she was, and also leaves us wondering what she could have still achieved. She did, though, leave us her genius, and so until the end of time, that incredible, unstoppable voice will continue to thunder on. Robin Williams, The Body Electric. Robin McLaurin Williams was not just electric, he was a live wire. He was lightning in a bottle. He was fire from the sky. Born July 21, 1951 in Chicago, Illinois and raised as an only child with busy parents, his father was an executive with Ford and his mother a model. Williams spent much of his early life alone, where he would often occupy his time in his family's palatial estate by memorizing Jonathan Winter's comedy albums, or staging amazingly elaborate battles with toy soldiers. His mother recalled in a 1993 interview with New York Magazine that Robin had the entire third floor. He put his toy soldiers, he had thousands of them, in those rooms, carefully divided according to period. Williams acted out the wars with what would become his trademark glee and mania, creating dialogue and unique voices for each of his warriors, a myriad of voices and personas that would later serve him very well. When he was in high school, Williams moved with his family to California, where he attended Redwood High School. It was here that, during his senior year, Robin Williams was voted funniest as well as least likely to succeed, proving that high school students' powers of prognostication are sketchy at best. After graduation, he attended Claremont Men's College before moving to New York City to attend the famed Juilliard School, where he became close friends and roommates with a young man named Christopher Reeve. Reeve would, of course, go on to give, perhaps, the most iconic performance of Superman ever seen on the big screen. Next, Williams was off to San Francisco and Los Angeles, where he built his manic, brilliant multiple personalities into a wildly entertaining and immensely popular stand-up comedy act. These performances were berserk rampages of brilliance barreling over and through topics like politics, sexuality and, of course, drugs, at a speed like the beat of a hummingbird's wings. You'd need to watch it in slow motion to see it all, and that, basically, was how Williams would live his entire life. Robin Williams' first shot at fame came when was hired to portray the zany alien Mork on an episode of the well-liked situation comedy Happy Days, where he waged a very silly battle against the paragon of cool that was Henry Winkler's The Phones. Williams' character was so engaging and exciting that he was quickly given his own show in the form of Mork and Mindy, a heartwarming and madcap sitcom about an alien living with an earthling lady, played by Pam Dauber. The show would run for 4 seasons and give Williams the opportunity to act alongside the man whose comedy he had once memorized, Mr. Jonathan Winters. Though Winters was Williams' senior by 26 years, he played Robin's son, Mearth. While his TV show was still in taking off, Williams played his first leading role in a feature film when he brought the world-famous cartoon character of Popeye to life on the silver screen. The career that followed was stellar on any scale you'd like to use. He found massive box office success as well as critical acclaim in films like Good Morning Vietnam and Dead Poets Society, and was nominated for multiple Academy Awards. Inspired by a British charity of the same name, a United States comic relief charity was founded in 1986 by Bob Zmuland. It was Williams, along with friends and fellow comedians Billy Crystal and Whoopi Goldberg, that hosted its first fundraiser. With the hard work and star power of Williams and his cohorts at the helm, Comic Relief raised $2.5 million in its first broadcast to help those in need, particularly homeless people in the U.S. Williams went on to host every subsequent Comic Relief broadcast, as well as serving as one of the organization's chief ambassadors. From its first efforts until present day, Comic Relief has raised more than $50 million to create programs tailored specifically to help the needy. A staggering amount of Money raised in no small part thanks to a man who seemed universally beloved. Unfortunately, as his success skyrocketed, he faced difficult relationships with both women and substance abuse. His first marriage was rocky to say the least. And he began battling addiction with narcotics and alcohol during his run on Mork and Mindy. Williams was, in fact, at the drug-fueled party in John Belushi's hotel room the night that Belushi passed away from an overdose. Robin had left the party earlier in the evening, and called the tragedy a wake-up call for a lot of young comedians who were abusing drugs. But a wake-up call is not the same thing as a cure, and Robin Williams would spend the next 2 decades of his life trying to break drugs and alcohol's hold on him. Williams himself once spoke eloquently on the subject with Rolling Stone magazine. I was 26 or 27, and then, bang, there's all this money, and there are the magazine covers, and it's you, there, staring back. Between the drugs and the women and all that stuff, it's all coming at you, and you're swallowed whole. As he struggled in his personal life, his career, however, seemed unstoppable. He continued to win box office praise, and in 1997, his riveting work in Good Will Hunting garnered him his first Academy Award. It was his 4th nomination, a virtually unheard of feat for an actor of any stripe, much less a man primarily known as a comedian. Later in his career, Williams, while still best known for his signature comedy, began taking on darker roles in films like 1 Hour Photo and Insomnia, a film in which he was directed by Christopher Nolan, who would go on to direct Heath Ledger in The Dark Knight, shortly before Ledger's tragic death. Williams suffered an addiction relapse in 2006 and checked himself into rehab, but quickly bounced back and continued working. In 2013, Williams, now married for the 3rd time, returned to television in earnest, something he had not done since Mork and Mindy. His show, The Crazy Ones, saw him co-starring with Sarah Michelle Gellar of Buffy the Vampire Slayer fame and was cancelled after only a single season. Williams is said to have taken the cancellation very hard, but he continued to work in film and continued to work on his sobriety, a difficult battle that he seemed to be winning. Unfortunately, addiction was not the only war Robin Williams was fighting. On August 11, 2014, the man who had spent virtually every moment of his life making people laugh and smile lost his fight with depression. He was found dead in his home at the age of 63. The Marin County Sheriff's Office released a statement shortly thereafter saying, "The preliminary results of the forensic examination revealed supporting physical signs that Mr. Williams' life ended from asphyxia due to hanging. To many, maybe even most people, it seems completely wrong, or backwards or counterintuitive, that someone who dedicated himself so fully and so brilliantly to joy would have found himself so beset by depression that this seemed like his best or only option. But as we are heartbreakingly reminded time and time again, it is a very fine line that separates the genius of unimaginable light of comedy from the dark cloak of tragedy. Laughter often conjures a darkness and horror. A comedian's job is to think obsessively about life and humanity, and that is one of the most dangerous things I can imagine." His wife, Susan Schneider, also revealed that Williams had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, a nervous system disorder that affects motor control and speech, but that he had not strayed from his sobriety. Tragically, being funny is not the same thing as being happy. And though Williams spread joy to millions upon millions of people, all of whom are better for having witnessed his gifts and hard work, he was unable or unwilling to do it anymore. The body of work he left behind, his 3 children and his uncontrollable kindness to those around him mean that, though he is no longer with us, a great Deal of him will never die. Our children and our children's children will watch in awe as he stomps across stages and movie screens until the end of time, and we will be grateful, as should we be, that Robin Williams shared so much with us. Corey Monteith, don't stop believing. Corey Allen Michael Monteith was born on May 11, 1982, in Calgary, Canada. Terrifically talented and terribly haunted, he would be at war with his addictions for more than half of his tragically short life. Though he was a gifted student, Monteith started skipping school to drink and experiment with various illegal substances while he was still in his early teens. By 16, he had officially dropped out of school to work odd jobs and perform in a number of bands as a drummer. At 19, his addictions had reached such severity that his family, worried about his health and the direction of his life, held an intervention to confront him. He was checked into rehab to address his problems, but relapsed horribly quickly after leaving treatment. It was only when he was caught stealing from a family member that he truly tried to live with sobriety. Sometimes we have to hit rock bottom before we can find ground strong enough to once again stand up. Monteith moved to a new town, away from the trappings of his addicted life, and very quickly looked to funnel his energies towards acting. In very short order he found work on several shows filmed in Canada, including Stargate Atlantis and Smallville, a popular and unexpectedly pretty great show about the origins of a young Superman, which included a recurring character played by the original big screen Superman, and good friend of Robin Williams, Christopher Reeve. More and more work followed for Monteith, but it was an audition tape on which he played Tupperware drums that would change everything. That audition led to his casting as one of the leads on a new Fox show, Glee, which, virtually right out of the gate, became a smash hit and a huge cultural phenomenon. Monteith told the Times columnist, "I still feel like they've made a mistake and someday they're going to realize I'm the wrong guy for the job." To me, more than anything else, that sentence speaks to Monteith's qualities as an artist. If you don't think you're a fraud, you will probably never be great. The popularity of Glee and Monteith were on the rise and, even more importantly, he began a loving, supportive relationship with his co-star Lee Michelle. Life was great for the young star. But addiction does not discriminate. It does not only haunt you when things are going badly, it is always there waiting for its moment to rise again. In March 2013, while still in production on Glee's fourth season, the now 30-year-old Monteith decided to again check himself into rehab for substance abuse. Discussing the news, Michelle told People magazine, "I love and support Corey, and will stand by him through this. I am grateful and proud that he made this decision." Though we don't know what prompted his decision to again seek treatment, we can easily conclude that he wanted to regain his sobriety before it affected his life negatively once again. Yet only a few months later, on July 14, Monteith was found dead in his hotel room in Vancouver, Canada. He was 31 years old. The British Columbia Coroner's Service's autopsy and toxicology analysis showed he was found in a collapsed position on the hotel room floor, having died several hours earlier from an overdose of both alcohol and heroin. A hypodermic needle as well as a spoon with a powdery residue was found near his body, along with 2 empty bottles of champagne and a number of glasses, but there was absolutely no sign of foul play. The report stated, "There is no evidence to suggest Mr. Monteith's death was anything other than a most tragic accident." One of the last meals Mr. Monteith's ever had was with a lady named Maureen Webb. Ms. Webb is the casting agent who discovered Mr. Monteith and helped launch his career. She is also the co-founder of a charitable organization called Project Limelight, which introduces at-risk children to the performing arts in the hopes that they might turn away from violence, drugs, alcohol, and any and all other risky behavior in favor of the highs of art and self-expression. This is a trade, one hopes, that leads to a much better and more fulfilling life. Chasing dreams, one might say, instead of chasing the dragon. Mr. Monteith was an early supporter and advocate for the program, as both Ms. Webb and the arts were instrumental and transformative for the gifted young man early in his troubled life. Corey Monteith continued to support the foundation in death, asking that, instead of flowers or memorials, people make a donation to Project Limelight to help children find a better way, much as Monteith did once. With all of the success, talent, and even love that a single man could ever hope for on his side, it was still, sadly, not enough to win his personal war against addiction. This is not a failing, just the heartbreaking final stage of a horrible disease. There is no comfort to be found in his tragic, sudden, and all too soon death. It leaves us with the terrible knowledge that everything can change and even end in a single, dreadful night. But in Corey Monteith's life there was hope, and there was joy. His time on this earth, horribly brief as it was, left us all with a great deal to celebrate. He was plagued by the devils of addiction almost his entire life, but he turned it all around. And after doing so, before the demons caught up to him again, he sang the songs to which the whole world danced. Surely Monteith was best remembered by his co-star Jane Lynch, who, during the 2013 Emmy Awards celebrated he friendlessly, he had a star quality and a genuine sweetness that made it impossible not to fall in love with him. And millions did fall in love with Corey, and I'm here to say that all that warmth and that charm, that open-hearted quality that we love in Corey, it was no act. Corey was a beautiful soul. He was not perfect, which many of us here tonight can relate to. His death is a tragic reminder of the rapacious, senseless destruction that is brought on by addiction. Tonight we remember Corey for all he was, and mourn the loss of all he could have been. Ernest Hemingway, Papa had a brand new bag and some hand grenades. Universally heralded as one of the great writers of the 20th century, Ernest Miller Hemingway was born in what is now Oak Park, Illinois on July 2, 1899. Though he was raised in the largely conservative Chicago suburb, he and his family also maintained a cabin in Michigan, and it was there that the future Nobel Prize winner for literature would first develop his affection for hunting, fishing, and the great outdoors. Directly after graduating high school, at the age of 17, Hemingway found work writing for the Kansas City Star newspaper, an experience that would hugely influence his later work in novels, where his language was uniquely simple and remarkably sparse. Soon, though, with World War I in full swing, Hemingway made his way across the pond to serve as an ambulance driver on the front lines with the Italian Army. While in service he was badly wounded, decorated with the Italian Silver Medal for bravery, and spent significant time in hospitals in Milan, where he met a young nurse named Agnes von Kurowski. Kurowski accepted his marriage proposal, but left him before the wedding. As horrible as heartbreak always is, she would serve as a key inspiration for several of Hemingway's most celebrated works. He recovered from his injuries, but not his post-war disillusionment, and, soon after returning to the States, quickly took off for Paris, where he became a key member of a group of expatriate artists that fellow writer Gertrude Stein would famously refer to as the Lost Generation. With Stein serving as his mentor, Hemingway became friends with many of the most illustrious writers and artists of the day, like Pablo Picasso, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ezra Pound, and James Joyce. A couple of marriages and some incredibly good books followed, and when Hemingway wasn't busy getting divorced or writing, he was living like few of us ever will. He went big game hunting in the African plains, he became a bullfighter in Spain, he stood on the beaches of Normandy during the D-Day invasion, reporting as an eyewitness to one of the most important military conflicts in history, and was a deep-sea fisherman in the much less exciting waters of Florida. What is not less exciting, of course, is the way the mad genius went about his angling. He routinely shot up circling sharks with a machine gun, so as to prevent them from eating his catch, and he even set a world record by catching 7 enormous marlins in a single day. But even this wasn't enough boating crazy for Mr. Hemingway. He also spent a great deal of 1942 and 43 on his wooden boat patrolling the shores of Cuba, hunting Nazi submarines with sophisticated locating equipment, guns, and hand grenades. Not only fiercely talented and incredibly adventurous, Hemingway also proved almost impossible to kill, which is a great talent to have if you're living his kind of life. In 1954, back adventure-seeking in Africa, a sightseeing flight he had chartered over the Belgian Congo toward Murchison Falls struck a utility pole and crashed. Hemingway suffered a head wound, and his wife, the third wife of 4, broke several ribs. The following day he chartered a second plane, trying to make his way to proper medical care in Entebbe. This plane exploded during takeoff. This time, Hemingway suffered serious burns, a second concussion on a second consecutive day, and was found to be leaking cerebral fluid, which in all honesty is probably one of the worst leaks to suffer. When the couple did finally get to Entebbe, they arrived to find many reporters working diligently to tell the world that Ernest Hemingway had died. He recuperated over the next several weeks and kept himself entertained by reading his own obituaries. In his lifetime, at the very least, Hemingway survived several wars, skin cancer, malaria, pneumonia, anthrax poisoning, diabetes, hepatitis, a ruptured kidney, a ruptured spleen, a ruptured liver, a fractured skull, crushed vertebra, and 2 plane crashes. It seems that the only thing that could possibly ever kill Ernest Hemingway was he himself. On July 2, 1961, at the age of 61, Ernest Hemingway died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. His fourth wife maintained it was a tragic accident that occurred while the writer was cleaning his favorite shotgun. But Hemingway had been an expert with firearms since the age of 10, and was given to bouts of severe depression, leading almost everyone to conclude his death was a suicide. The exact nature of the incident is still unknown, and surely always will be. Suicide, horribly, runs in the Hemingway family. Ernest's father, grandfather, brother, sister, and granddaughter all took their own lives. This awful trend, as well as many of Hemingway's known symptoms, have led many in the modern medical community to believe something else runs in the family, a hereditary disorder called hemochromatosis, which causes toxic levels of iron to flood the body, inducing internal damage, cirrhosis of the liver, heart disease, agony, and severe depression. What is not disputed, of course, is the fact that the man was a world heavyweight talent the likes of which may never be seen again. His death should serve as a cautionary tale to seek medical help and second opinions if one is experiencing pain or depression. His life should serve as a challenge to all of us to be truly, unstoppably bold. He won a Pulitzer Prize, a Nobel Prize, and as much immortality as any human could ever hope for. He lived big, he lived huge, and he lived on his own terms. Who could ask for more? Marilyn Monroe, Beauty and Her Beasts. Any list of history's most celebrated and most enduring symbols of sex and beauty would have to include the woman born with the name Norma Jean Mortensen and baptized as Norma Jean Baker. Of course, the world will always know her simply as Marilyn. The horror of Monroe's childhood is as striking and almost as legendary as her beauty. She never knew her father, though for a time she believed, absent of any supporting evidence, that she was Clark Gable's daughter. Perhaps much worse than not knowing her father, though, was having known her mom. Monroe's earliest memory was of her mother trying to smother her to death with a pillow as she lay in her crib. Fittingly, it would certainly seem, Monroe's mother was placed in a mental institution while Marilyn was very young. This led to a series of foster homes, where Monroe was sexually assaulted on a number of occasions. A high school dropout who was desperate for an escape from her brutal foster situation married her boyfriend Jimmy Doherty at the age of 16. Doherty was a merchant marine who, shortly after their wedding, found himself stationed in the South Pacific. With her husband away, Monroe took a job in a munitions factory in Burbank, California. Even in a weapons factory, though, beauty like Marilyn's could not be hidden, and she was quickly discovered by a photographer who recognized her rare beauty. When her husband returned in 1946, he came home to a wife who was a successful model and had changed her name in pursuit of her dream of becoming an actress. That same year, as Monroe transformed her hair into her signature platinum blonde for the first time and focused on her career, her marriage fell to pieces. But her star was just beginning to rise. Soon she would be one of Hollywood's most iconic faces both at home and abroad. Her films were wildly popular and would gross over $200 million in her lifetime, which, adjusted for inflation, would be well over $1 billion today. Perhaps her most famous role was as the absurdly named Sugar Cane Kowalczyk in the uproarious and incredibly successful film Some Like It Hot. That film saw her star opposite a pair of screen legends in Jack Lemmon and Tony Curtis, who, in the film, find themselves dressed in drag and running from the mafia after having accidentally witnessed the famous St. Valentine's Day massacre. Marilyn would receive a Golden Globe for Best Actress in a comedy for her work in the movie. While her popularity with audiences seemed all but unstoppable, her instability and her inability to arrive on the movie set on time strained her relationships with both directors and co-stars alike. She suffered from terrible anxiety and was constantly haunted by the atrocious traumas of her youth, so she sought refuge in drugs and alcohol. She would take barbiturates to calm down, or to sleep, which caused her to miss work, which upset her co-workers. Often she would take amphetamines to try to sail a course through her drug-induced stupors, which would often leave her edgy and erratic, so she would need the barbiturates to calm herself again. Monroe's last completed film was an adventure drama called The Misfits, in which she co-starred with the man she once believed to be her father, Clark Gable. Because the universe really does seem to have a sense of humor, she would not see any other pictures through to completion. Perhaps the only thing in Hollywood history that is more talked about than Marilyn's life, though, is her death. What we know for sure is that she was found dead in her home in Los Angeles on August 5, 1962. She was lying nude on her bed, face down, and in one hand still rested a telephone. Empty bottles of pills, mostly those legally prescribed for her depression, were scattered about the room. After a short time, some would, almost certainly correctly, argue shoddy investigation. The Los Angeles police decided that her death was caused by a self-administered overdose of sedative. drugs, and that the mode of death is probable suicide. She was only 36 years old. Everything else seems shrouded in mystery, and destined to stay that way, with a great deal of the evidence, such as the police files and interviews collected during the investigation, either destroyed or misplaced. Perhaps the missing items were the result of run-of-the-mill poor workmanship, perhaps they were taken as macabre souvenirs of one of the most famous faces in the history of the world, or perhaps, if you are given to conspiracy theories, maybe it's all part of a massive cover-up. Officially, Monroe fell into a coma the night before she passed away as a result of an overdose of sleeping pills. Extrapolation from the autopsy results shows she had taken 60 to 70 capsules of a drug called Nembutal, more than 3 times the lethal dose. This was on top of 17 capsules of chloral hydrate, almost a toxic dose on its own. Given this evidence, her death was officially ruled as suicide. She was given to dramatic mood swings and had tried to take her own life no fewer than 4 times before, so it was not and is not an unreasonable conclusion to arrive at. Other people, however, point to accidental death being more likely, due to certain inconsistencies with the autopsy and the usual markers of suicide. Friends and family said she had been in exceptional spirits the day of her death, and that if she were going to try to kill herself again, it wouldn't have been that night. And then, of course, there is the wildly unsubstantiated speculation that she was murdered. Not just murder, of course. Marilyn never did anything that wasn't incredibly dramatic, and these theories certainly fit that bill. Many, if not most of the murder plots that have been imagined surround an affair with a sitting President of the United States and his brother. Some say that JFK called off his affair with the legendary actress that fateful night, charging RFK, his brother as well as his Attorney General, with delivering the news, and it was that rejection that caused her to end her life. Others have come up with more sinister theories of powerful men to whom she could have done massive damage, having purposefully ended her life, a final solution to a problem they could not otherwise solve. Interestingly, fully 20 years after Monroe's death, her housekeeper, Eunice Murray, officially corroborated at least part of the story, saying that Robert Kennedy had in fact called on Monroe on the night of her death, and that the two got into a heated argument. No one has ever verified this, and Murray's honesty and motives have been traditionally viewed as questionable at best. In the end, what we can know for certain is that she was here and now she is not. But in the time she spent on this earth she captivated the entire world, and left behind a legacy that will be discussed and admired forever. John Belushi, too funny for this world? John Adam Belushi was born in Wheaton, Illinois on January 24, 1949, a town Belushi's future wife would describe as caring, very much about football games and beauty contests. He would be dead only 33 years later, but the joy he created in his short time on earth may never fade away. Never not funny, Belushi was one of 4 children born to immigrant parents from Albania, a homeland Belushi, for whatever reason, was reluctant to discuss. He was not what one might call a perfect student. In the 6th grade, his exasperated teachers briefly demoted him all the way back to the 2nd grade in an attempt to get him to stop acting up in class. Much less funny and much more cruel than this is that, also in the 6th grade, his gym teacher called him to the front of a class of 400 students, shouted that Belushi was the worst student in the class and kicked him in the groin. Speaking of his experience in school to Rolling Stone magazine, Belushi once said, "They crushed the spirit out of me by the time I left." Awful, and as incredibly illegal as that experience was, Belushi's spirit was, we can all be thankful, more resilient than even he seemed to realize. He still desired a great deal from life, and he knew what he wanted to do. He wanted to be a performer. After graduating from high school, he went on to act in summer stock productions of various plays before heading off to the University of Wisconsin and the College of DuPage, where, in 1970, he graduated with an associate degree. As fine an accomplishment as that was, it was never going to be academics that launched the larger-than-life Belushi, and the next year he exploded onto the scene of the fabled Second City Theater. It was there, in Chicago, that he would first give audiences a taste of the brilliance he had to offer. And from his still legendary work there, it was a short jump to television. One of the original cast members of the now renowned program Saturday Night Live, Belushi was perhaps the breakout star of a pioneering comedy show filled with virtually nothing but electric geniuses. The show and all of its stars had a take no prisoners approach to comedy, delightfully skewering politics and pop culture of the day in a way that had never been seen on television before. Belushi was particularly known for his gut-busting takes on the likes of Elizabeth Taylor, Henry Kissinger and Truman Capote. As Belushi's fame grew, however, so did the pressures to perform exclusively and continuously at the highest levels, and, with that pressure bearing down on him, his own insecurities exploded, too. Tragically, like so many brilliant comics before and since, Belushi sought shelter from these storms under the deadly ceiling of drugs and alcohol. His short film career was a mixed bag of extreme highs and extreme disappointments. In National Lampoon's Animal House, he created one of the single most enduring comic personas in history with his overtly disgusting, unstoppably entertaining Bluto Blutarsky. Since the day that this film was released in 1978, a year that saw Belushi posters begin to hang in hundreds of college dorms across the world, other big screen efforts, such as the Spielberg directed 1941, however, fared less well with critics and audiences. Sadly, though, in good times and in bad, Belushi always found a reason to turn to substance abuse. When things were going well, he felt he needed to look to drugs for inspiration and energy. When they were going badly, he felt he needed them for comfort and relief. Of course, like so many with all the talent and fortune in the world, the real reason he always turned to drugs and alcohol was simple and heartbreaking: he was an addict. John Belushi did try to walk away from drugs. In fact, he tried many times. Unfortunately, he never was quite able to pull it off. He tried to go cold turkey, believing he could get out from under them through sheer willpower. Terribly, though, as has been shown countless times since the advent of narcotic abuse, willpower is almost certainly never enough. He tried to change his environments, often going to the famed Martha's Vineyard for a change of scenery and a vacation from the habits that he felt fed his addictions. But an addict carries his addictions wherever they go. He even hired large scary men to guard him around the clock, making sure he couldn't slip up and, essentially, trading their will for his own. In the long run, and despite his brave efforts, nothing ever worked. What didn't help were the efforts of dozens and dozens of friends and fans who wanted Belushi to be high just so he would behave like the wild man they loved on TV. His longtime friend Penny Marshall, who knew him even before his SNL days, told The Hollywood Reporter, "I swear, you'd walk down the street with him, and people would hand him drugs. Then he'd do all of them and then be the kind of character he played in his live sketches or in Animal House." Film critic Roger Ebert once wrote with a great deal of sorrow, "I remember John from the early 1970s, in Old Town, where, to put it cruelly, you'd put drinks into him like quarters into a jukebox, and he'd entertain everyone in the room. Of course, it wasn't all given to him. In his last months, People magazine reported that Belushi was spending $2,500 a week on his addictions, while legendary journalist Bob Woodward reported that cocaine allowances were specifically built into many of his contracts, like one might expect to be done for housing or food. During his final few days, Belushi rented a bungalow at the storied Hollywood Hotel Chateau Marmont to work on a, now infamous, screenplay called Noble Rot. And he was indulging much of the time. On the night of March 4, 1982, he was reportedly partying heavily with friends, including the similarly touched genius and similarly addicted Robin Williams, who was with Belushi on his last night on Earth. The next day he was found dead in his room. The official cause of death was an overdose of cocaine and heroin mixed together in what is commonly known as a speedball. Speaking on Belushi's passing, Lorne Michaels, the creator and producer of Saturday Night Live, said, "Hollywood was toxic to him." While Williams remarked that his death scared a whole group of show business people. It caused a big exodus from drugs. John Belushi's death was a tragedy on par with any other passing in entertainment history, but a generous reading of the circumstances might reveal that he saved a lot of lives. His death was not, however, ruled a straight accidental death. A woman named Kathy Smith, who was with him at the time, and who supplied him with and administered the drugs that fateful night, was charged with his murder. She pled guilty to involuntary manslaughter and was sentenced to 15 months in prison. Smith was not innocent, nor were any of the dozens and dozens of people who supported Belushi's mistakes, including, of course, the star himself. But the real killer was certainly the disease of addiction. If only we could lock addiction away in a prison cell for the rest of time, then who knows how many of the greats would still be here? And who knows how many would not leave us in the future? Judy Garland, Over the Rainbow, Never on Time. Born in Grand Rapids, Minnesota on June 10, 1922 under the name Frances Ethel Gumm, Judy Garland was an international sensation by 16 and, tragically, gone from this world by 46. Both of her parents were vaudeville players who brought their incredibly gifted daughter on stage under the name Baby Gumm at only 30 months of age. She was singing professionally almost before she could walk. By 13, she was working in Hollywood, and working a lot. Her first breakout was in a role in the 1936 musical comedy feature, Pigskin Parade. True. A musical about football might seem counterintuitive today, but it launched Garland's career. From there on she made a starring turn in Love Finds Andy Hardy, acting opposite Mickey Rooney. The two were beloved together on screen and would work together often over the next several years, including making 2 more Andy Hardy movies. But, as is so often the case, as her professional life soared, Garland's personal life fell into difficulty. Shortly before Pigskin Parade, she lost her father to spinal meningitis, and his death took a heavy toll on her. Still a teenager, she was also under constant pressure about her weight from studio executives. She was given amphetamines to energize her and to manage her figure, and soon she relied on the uppers constantly. Then she would be too wired to rest and need more drugs to sleep. At age 16, she would etch her name into Hollywood history as the star of The Wizard of Oz, one of the most storied and influential movies ever made. Horribly, though, thanks in no small part to her studio handlers, by this time she was already terribly addicted to those stimulants and depressants. Garland wrote heartbreakingly about the experience, saying, "They'd give us pep pills. Then they'd take us to the studio hospital and knock us cold with sleeping pills. After 4 hours they'd wake us up and give us the pep pills again. That's the way we worked, and that's the way we got thin. That's the way we got mixed up. And that's the way we lost contact." If there's any constant in this book, it's that celebrity can be toxic in an array of horrible ways, with a multitude of influences both internal and external. The constant work and constant drugs took an excruciating toll on her life, professionally and personally. Keeping with her tradition of doing everything early, Garland entered into her first of 5 marriages at the ripe old age of 19. By 24, she had divorced her first husband and married her second, director Vincent Minnelli, who had been at the helm of another of her signature films, Meet Me in St. Louis. The very talented and very famous Liza Minnelli was born to the young couple in 1946. That marriage proved to be only marginally more durable than her first, and Garland unofficially split from her husband in 1949, they were divorced in 1952. It was during this time that she came to be known in Hollywood as unstable and unreliable, often showing up for work late or not at all. At the age of 28 she was dropped from her studio contract with MGM, with the producers citing the very behavior they caused as a reason for termination. As a result of all of this, Judy Garland tried to take her own life. The career and life that followed her dismissal from MGM was a roller coaster ride of legendary performances and of some shows that went the other way. Of love, marriage, and divorce, well, they seemingly went on without end. She would spend more time singing than acting in the years that followed, but managed a number of fantastic performances in both disciplines. She starred on Broadway in her own show, which was routinely sold out and ran for over 5 months straight. It would also earn her a Tony Award. Then she would falter, of course, and then she would rise again, continuing the vicious cycle of addiction. She was the comeback queen. Whenever her personal life and her career would collapse, she would find a way to resurrect them both with fabulous style and fury. In 1963, Garland tried her hand at television, starring in a variety series called The Judy Garland Show. The show took many different approaches to the still nascent medium of TV, but despite excellent performances from Garland as well as cameos from her daughters Lorna Looked and Liza Minnelli, as well as her former screen partner Mickey Rooney, the Judy Garland just couldn't seem to find an audience. This was due in no small part to the fact that it aired on Sunday nights opposite the juggernaut that was Bonanza. With her show cancelled and no film career left, Garland, hard as it may be to believe considering her iconic standing, was flat broke. She was deeply in debt to the IRS for unpaid taxes and became basically homeless. She never had to live on the street, of course, but her house was repossessed and she couldn't afford another one. Though battling depression and going through yet another divorce, Garland tried to pay off her debts by performing on stage all around the world. She was still trying to pay back the government when she passed away just days after her 47th birthday. In total, she starred in dozens of films, sang on countless records and managed 5 marriages, 4 divorces, 3 children, and 1 abortion in the short 47 years before she, tragically, passed away from an accidental overdose of sleeping pills in London on June 22, 1969. Elvis, even kings are not immortal. Who exactly is the most famous person to ever live? The answer to this question may be completely unknowable in any definitive way, but any list of the top 10 of all time would almost certainly have to include Elvis Presley. Born to humble circumstances in East Tupelo, Mississippi on January 8, 1935. Elvis was actually a twin, but sadly his brother, Jesse Garon Presley, was stillborn. Unlike so many stars who are perpetually haunted by their traumatic childhoods, Elvis was actually raised by two loving parents who taught him to have great and lasting faith in God. In fact, it was at church that he was first introduced to gospel music, which would remain hugely influential to the singer over the course of his legendary career. He was given his first guitar at the age of 10, and just over a single decade later, in 1956, he would have a #1 single with Heartbreak Hotel, a #1 record with the eponymous Elvis Presley, and would sign his first film contract with Paramount Pictures. He was the world's first true megastar of rock and roll, and was well on his way to becoming one of the most culturally influential forces of all time. Elvis was discovered by a man who called himself Colonel Tom Parker, who would continue to micromanage every aspect of Elvis's life until the end. Parker was incredibly instrumental in helping to make his only client one of the greatest success stories in history. The Colonel, as he liked to be known, despite never having risen beyond the rank of private in his brief military stint, would also of course be instrumental in making his only client one of the saddest stories ever. That depicts a harrowing fall from grace. Interestingly, hilariously for that matter, before he found his golden goose in Elvis, the Colonel's greatest success was an act called Colonel Parker's Dancing Chickens. That act, as one might guess, involved dancing chickens. Parker was able to make them dance by using, as a stage, a hot plate, which he would turn on and off. Elvis's feature film debut Love Me Tender was a great success, but the following year he was drafted into the U.S. military, where he would go on to serve in Germany for over a year. Life, for better or worse, often seems to give and take. Shortly before he went into active duty, his mother, Gladys, to whom Elvis was particularly dedicated, passed away. But while overseas, the rock and roll superstar met a teenage daughter of an army officer named Priscilla Beaulieu. The young lady would, of course, go on to be named Priscilla Presley. His stint in the armed forces did nothing whatsoever to dampen his popularity. An almost unimaginable success, and the career that followed would cement Elvis as the undisputed king of rock and roll. His professional accomplishments are without question some of the most amazing in music history. Since his first recording, he has sold over 1 billion albums to date, which produced 114 top 40, 40 top 10 and 18 #1 songs. In all, Elvis holds the greatest number of gold, platinum and multi-platinum records of anyone in history. However, his personal life, Elvis was haunted by doubts about himself and the team of people he chose to surround himself with. He was discontented with life in general and increasingly distrustful of the public, whom he went to great lengths to avoid, lengths that included things like renting out entire amusement parks after hours so he could ride the rides on his own. Interestingly, years later, the only person to ever approach Elvis's level of success in the music industry, the man who would become Elvis's son-in-law, Michael Jackson, would take this same concept even further by actually building his own personal amusement park at the home he briefly shared with Elvis's daughter. Elvis wasn't just shy or wary, though. In Priscilla's book Elvis and Me, the King of Rock's wife even suggested her husband might have had a complete nervous breakdown. Presley is said to have, on more than one occasion, made sweeping declarations about leaving it all behind and quitting the business of music and performing. Worse than hating your job, of course, is feeling like you can't quit. Presley, despite his staggering success, had significant debts and extreme financial obligations to his family, his entourage, and his huge family that made quitting impossible. Or at the very least made it seem impossible to the king. Not only had Elvis been generally awful with his money, and generous to a fault, he had been the victim of some truly awful management. While earning 10 to 15% of a client's wages was and is standard for a manager, the Colonel was taking a full 50% of Elvis's earnings. Parker was also blocking any and all offers to play overseas, including an astonishing offer of $10 million to play a single show in Saudi Arabia, and selling off Elvis's back catalog of songs for literally billions less than they were worth. Despite his unbelievable success, Elvis was broke. And he still employed and/or supported just about everyone he had ever met. Elvis felt he couldn't make a better, quieter life for himself without destroying the lives of all the people who depended on him. So, it seems, he sought to medicate his unhappiness away. It was a selfless decision that would lead, almost certainly, to his untimely death. Though it was almost completely unknown during his lifetime, we now know that Elvis was abusing narcotics, particularly amphetamines, while in the army. And maybe even before entering military service. But his reliance on prescription drugs from barbiturates to tranquilizers and, of course, amphetamines became increasingly dangerous in his later years. Elvis had a number of physically painful conditions that may have begun his affair with drugs, and, interestingly, he remained religious to the point of never consuming any alcohol, all while dosing himself to the gills with narcotics. 2. Top it off, whether it was complete denial or simple hypocrisy, he even publicly decried recreational drugs on a consistent basis. In a 1970 meeting with the sitting President of the United States, Richard Nixon, Elvis was even given a badge naming him an honorary officer in the Drug Enforcement Administration. The universe, as I've said, really does have a sense of humor. Only a few years later, on August 16, 1977, Elvis Presley was found dead in his bathroom at his Memphis home by his girlfriend, Ginger Alden. He was only 42 years old. His passing was initially said to have been a result of congestive heart failure. But later investigations discovered that drug use was likely to blame, at least in part if not in whole, for his death. The Presley family was allowed to keep the official autopsy findings private, which has led to wild speculation in the decades since his passing. What is not up for speculation, of course, is the impact Elvis had and continues to have on artists and citizens of every kind the world over. His home, Graceland, is a historical landmark, open to the public and visited by countless fans each year. He changed the world with his incredible talent and his ineffable charisma, and as long as rock and roll exists, he will reign as king. If any further proof of this is needed, consider this astonishing fact. It is currently estimated that more than 50,000 people around the world are currently making their living solely as Elvis impersonators. These are not people picking up a little spending money on the side. These are people who pay all of their bills and feed their families just by pretending to be the king. That may be the very definition of a legacy that will never die. Live for us all. Through coincidence, providence, or just through consistent symptoms of similar ailments, a line can be drawn through almost all of the lives discussed in these pages. James Dean and Marilyn Monroe had the same acting teacher, and Monroe was portrayed on screen, years after her death, by Michelle Williams, the very woman who had a daughter with Heath Ledger. Ledger would be directed in his final completed film by Christopher Nolan, who directed Robin Williams in one of his darker roles in Insomnia. Robin Williams partied with John Belushi on the very night Belushi died, and Williams was also close friends with Christopher Reeve, who appeared on the television show Smallville with Cory Monteith. The line goes on and is as meaningful or pointless as you'd like it to be, but there it is to be followed or ignored. The most important line that can be drawn, though, is that in almost every case, depression played a key and awful role in the untimely, unthinkable death of truly great men and women. And while fame and even greatness is clearly not in any way a cure or an immunization for depression, anxiety, or any other condition, and while it can even be an inciting or exacerbating force, afflictions like depression and suicidal thoughts are certainly not limited to the rich and famous. Suicide does not discriminate. So an immensely important thing to take away from this is, if you are suffering from depression, or if you know anyone who is, please get help. Resources like the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline exist solely to help those in need. By calling them at 1-800-273-8255, or visiting them on the web, you can learn the characteristics that a person may exhibit that make it more likely someone may consider, attempt or die due to suicide. You can assess risk factors, learn how to develop a step-by-step guide for staying safe during difficult times, and get connected to crisis centers and counselors who can help. Think back to how many of the men and women we discussed were alone when they died, either accidentally or with intent, and then think also about how differently things could be if they had found the help they needed. Willpower alone is almost never enough to deal with addiction, depression, or really any of the myriad of challenges you may be facing or may face in the future. The world is full of kind, talented, educated people who want to understand what you are going through, who want to help, and who, above all else, want you to live. Alexander. One more thing. I would be grateful if you took the time to leave an honest review of this book in the applicable Amazon store. Whether you loved it, hated it, or were indifferent, I appreciate you taking the time to share your opinion of it with myself and others. You can do so here. Next part. Celebrity deaths that rocked Hollywood and the world. On this planet, as of this moment, the statistics are heartbreaking and staggering. According to the World Health Organization, one person dies of suicide every 40 seconds. That adds up to more than 800,000 people who will die every year by their own hand. While suicide is most prevalent in low and middle income countries, the wealthiest people in the wealthiest places on earth are not immune from diseases such as drug and alcohol addiction and depression that can often lead people to take their own lives. People who have so much to live for, people who are celebrated and beloved, can still be at severe risk. In a subset of a subset of a subset, though, there is a strange statistical convergence of brilliant young men and women, primarily musicians, dying as a result of their own actions at the age of 27. It's often said that if you look hard enough for a pattern you're likely to find it. And, sadly, people die every day, at every age. But there does seem to exist a bizarre anomaly connecting geniuses to not just early death, but death at the exact age of 27 years old. In the last century, more than 50 young stars have shuffled loose from their mortal coil at exactly that age. Amazing, transformative people like Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Kurt Cobain, and Amy Winehouse all passed away at 27. This horrible phenomenon has given rise to what rock historians have dubbed the 27 Club. Is it little more than a statistical blip? Or is there really some fateful convergence that seems to tell us that no matter how great or amazing you are, that no matter If you change the whole darn world, and produce the kind of art that will never fade away, that you are fated to die young. It's almost as if the human body, containing too much brilliance, cannot sustain that level of genius for more than 27 years. In the following pages we will discuss what events led to 10 of the greatest artists to, purposefully or not, end their journeys in that specific year of life. In doing so we will hopefully discover a way to recognize the risk factors and signs of danger that we can then use in our own lives, and the lives of our friends, to stem the tide of suicide and risky behavior in all age groups. While we are taking a look these 10 tragic deaths, we will celebrate their phenomenal lives, which touched so many of us in so many ways. While being careful not to romanticize their deaths, we will elevate the lives of these men and women who will never be questioned and or ignored, even from the great beyond. Amy Winehouse, Back to Black. A taxi cab driver and a pharmacist do not seem like a couple most likely to give birth to an absolute force of nature, but that's exactly what happened when Mitch and Janice Winehouse brought their daughter Amy into the world on September 14, 1983. The universe has constantly shown that it has a deep sense of irony, and Ms. Winehouse's story is a perfect example. The singer, who would become an international superstar, best known for her tragic ballad of defiance called Rehab, spent most of her childhood growing up in a London suburb called Southgate, a place best known for being the home of the Priory, a rehabilitation facility offering treatment for drug and alcohol addiction commonly frequented, of course, by the famous stars of the day. Winehouse grew up surrounded by music, and, at the tender age of 10 formed a hip-hop group she named Sweet and Sour. Those words could describe each of the too few days that would follow for this unbelievably talented, incorrigible young lady. At age 12, she gained acceptance into Sylvia Young Theatre School, a prominent and esteemed performing arts school, that has turned out a number of the UK's brightest stars like Doctor Who's Billie Piper and Nicholas Hoult, one of the leading men of the X-Men feature film franchise. When Winehouse was 16, she was expelled from the academy for not applying herself as well as for piercing her nose. For an entity as immensely gifted as Amy Winehouse, it is genuinely hard to imagine a crime more grievous than not working to live up to her astounding potential. It is equally hard to imagine anything sillier than expelling a talent of her caliber, or any caliber for that matter, for piercing their nose. Winehouse did not spend much time licking those wounds and soon she signed her first record deal that same year. Her debut album, Frank, was released in 2003 to instant critical acclaim. It was a heady amalgam of jazz, pop, and even a little hip-hop, harkening back to the sweet and sour days of her childhood. But while critics and audiences found an awful lot to like in the album, Winehouse was less pleased, telling the British newspaper The Sun, "I can't even listen to Frank anymore. In fact, I've never been able to." While Frank was building Winehouse's professional legend, the singer was busy building her personal legacy of instability and addiction. She often appeared too drunk to perform or talk lucidly during her concerts and in her television appearances. This was also the time she met a man named Blake Fielder Civil, who would go on to become her husband and, as many might argue, her executioner. Fielder Civil introduced Winehouse to hard drugs and served as half of a couple, given to such vicious arguments that they were known to come to blows. The torrid, tormented love affair revolved constantly around drugs, drinking, abuse, and self-harm. Things quickly got so bad that Winehouse's managers insisted she enter rehab for her addictions. And go to rehab she did, for 15 minutes. according to her own account. Which she told the Sun. I went in and said, hello, and explained that I drink. Because I'm in love and have expletive up the relationship. Then I walked out. After that walkout, Winehouse fired her management company and span the situation into her most iconic, and most tragically ironic, single, Rehab. The song was an instant hit commercially and won Winehouse a number of high-profile awards. When her album Back to Black debuted in America, it became the highest charting debut album for any British female artist in history. After some, to put it somewhat mildly, on-again off-again turmoil, Winehouse and Fielder Civil were married in a small ceremony in Miami, Florida. Speaking of her nuptials, one of the most gifted musicians the world has ever known told Rolling Stone, I know I'm talented, but I wasn't put here to sing. I was put here to be a wife and a mom. Less than 3 months later, Amy Winehouse fell into a coma after overdosing on a cocktail of drugs including cocaine, ecstasy, whiskey, vodka, and heroin. Her North American tour was, understandably, put on hold so that Winehouse could work with her doctors to recover. The following year, with her husband now in prison for assault, and for trying to bribe a witness, a video of Winehouse smoking crack cocaine found its way online, causing an international uproar and sending the singer back to rehab for another attempt at battling her demons and coming out on the other side, a sober woman. Amy Winehouse could not seem to stop poisoning herself, and she could not stop being amazing, either. That year, though, she was denied entrance to the United States due to what the State Department termed her use and abuse of narcotics, so she could not appear in person at the Grammy Awards. Instead, she sang live via satellite and gave the performance of a lifetime during a ceremony in which she won a total of 5 Grammy Awards, including Record of the Year, Best New Artist, and Song of the Year. This astounding feat made her the first British singer to win 5 Grammy Awards, and tied her with Beyoncé Knowles for a record for most Grammy wins by a female in 1 year. The next few years would find Winehouse on a roller coaster ride of personal and professional highs and lows. She was arrested for assaulting a fan, she divorced from Fielder Civil and then reconciled. And there were more trips to rehab until there was no life left to try and save. Only 2 months after her final attempt at treatment, on July 23, 2007, Amy Winehouse was found dead in her London apartment. She is said to have spent her final hours on Earth alone, drinking vodka and watching videos of herself online. The coroner's official verdict was, death by misadventure. The less poetic description is that she drank herself to death. After several weeks of total abstinence, she simply drank so much that she stopped breathing. She was found to have more than 5 times the legal driving limit of alcohol in her system. The only drugs she was found to have taken were a completely normal amount of prescription medication given to her to help her manage the symptoms of alcohol withdrawal. Amy Winehouse was 27 years, 312 days old when she left us. She gave the world a number of great gifts, and her music will echo through time forever. But it's hard not to want to hear the rest of the brilliance she had left to give. As Rolling Stone said on the occasion of her death, we'll never hear those records, and the silence is deafening. Jean-Michel Basquiat, A Collage of Beauty and Grief. If one were to look for the cultural advantages of diversity in a coming together to create something new and beautiful in the great melting pot that is the United States of America, one needs to look no further than Jean-Michel Basquiat. An artist of unimaginable imagination and boundless talent, he was born in Park Slope, Brooklyn, New York on December 22, 1960 to a Haitian-American father and a Puerto Rican mother. Over the course of his tragically short life, he would draw from the heritage of both of his parents as a font of inspiration. Another two sources of great inspiration would turn out to be very accidental and immensely painful. When he was only 8 years old, he was struck by a car. Amongst other injuries, his spleen was badly damaged and had to be removed, and he was hospitalized for a full month. While convalescing, his mother gave him a copy of what the New York Times calls the infamous drawing book of Gray's Anatomy, which he devoured as he recovered. Both the book and the vehicular accident would be referenced time and again in his later work. At 15, the budding painter ran away from home and lived in Washington Square Park, where he first began to pretend he was from the street, rather than an accountant's home, and where he would start taking LSD and other drugs. For money, he sold hand-painted t-shirts and postcards on the street. It was here that he met and became friends with fellow struggling artists Keith Haring and Kenny Scharf. The trio became the vanguard of the new graffiti movement that was sweeping the streets of the East Village in the late 1970s on its way to taking over the art world entirely. Basquiat, decked out in a green trench coat and sporting a blonde mohawk atop his head, worked under the name Samo at the time. His canvases were subway trains and New York City buildings, which he would tag with enigmatic art, witty slogans, and his most common signature, a copyright symbol. For his efforts, he quickly became something of an underground sensation. Fame and fortune were not far away for the gifted young painter who had dropped out of high school to peruse his passions and to garner fame. But drugs like heroin and cocaine were already taking a toll on him, causing him to routinely cycle between bliss and paranoia. By 1980 he was 20 years old and an unlikely superstar in the elite world of art, where his neo-expressionistic style had patrons clamoring for the privilege of spending as much as $50,000 for an original painting. More than that, they were dying for the chance to watch him paint in person with a mountain of cocaine stacked on the canvas while he painted, wrote, drew and erased his work. The process of erasure would become as much a part of his work as the paint itself. It's no coincidence that he came to fame in the 80s. His life was an analog for the entire culture of the decade, of excess in work and play, in a time when tragedy became entertainment and everything was for sale. It's no coincidence that the 80s gave birth to his short, brilliant career, and it was almost a foregone conclusion that he would not survive the decade. After several years of manic painting, he would sometimes complete as many as 8 in a week. Manic sales, he would routinely sell out entire galleries of very expensive work in minutes, and, perhaps, even more manic drug abuse. Basquiat collaborated with his hero and the very personification of both the 80s ethos and of contemporary art, Andy Warhol. Warhol was fascinated both by Basquiat's energy and his excesses, which also somewhat horrified him, and as the two worked together, they quickly became inseparable. They lived and partied together non-stop for months, and their brief friendship was legendary. The show that they produced together featured a series of corporate logos and cartoon characters meshed together in a prototype for the remix culture that would pervade art at virtually every level 20 years later. Yet, whether it was ahead of its time or just not very good, the exhibition was a critical disaster. Soon Warhol found himself unable to deal with Basquiat's drug addictions, which led him to act out terrifying episodes, hallucinations, and to occasionally slash his work to pieces. The pair went their separate ways. Shortly thereafter, Basquiat, desperate to defeat his constant, destructive need for heroin, took off to Hawaii for several months, where he hoped the change of Scenery would offer hope and change. Geographical solutions to internal problems are common amongst addicts, and, sadly, are almost always useless. Addicts carry the disease with them wherever they go. Soon after returning to New York, on August 12, 1988, the eclectic Jean-Michel Basquiat died of a drug overdose. His body was found by his girlfriend, who initially thought he was just sleeping through the day, like he always did. The door to his bathroom was open, offering a view of the artist's jacuzzi tub on which was stacked a small assortment of syringes, still tinged with blood. Beside the tub, the bathroom window was smashed, and below the hole, in Basquiat's handwriting, were the words "broken heart." He was 27 years, 234 days old. The New York Times would later reflect on the tragedy of Basquiat's life, saying that he was hyped to death, and maybe he was. He seemed to have two great hungers. He hungered to create, and he hungered for drugs. The art world and the hedonistic, frankly awful culture of the 1980s fed on both of these needs until there was nothing left. In the end, the decade devoured him. But not before he became the first world heavyweight African-American painter. Not before he changed the art world forever, and not before establishing a legacy that can never be erased or slashed to pieces. Jim Morrison, Yell Fire. There are things known and there are things unknown, and in between are the doors. This quotation, William Blake by way of Aldous Huxley, would prove to be, perhaps, the most defining quotation of one of the most defining musicians in history. While much about his death will likely remain on the unknown side of perception, the things we do know are well worth discussing. Born under the name James Douglas Morrison, to a Navy officer father and a homemaker mother, Jim Morrison would go on to define a rebellious, disaffected generation. Before he was an icon, he was a child. Brilliant and dutiful at first, and disobedient and experimental as a teenager, Morrison came to resent his military father's stringency and rules, and, shortly thereafter, he rebelled against any form of authority. In college, Morrison transferred to the University of California, Los Angeles to study film. At that point, film was very new to academic settings, and this offered Morrison a rare education opportunity, a field of study with virtually no establishment. If no one really knew anything, no one could tell the future superstar what was right or wrong. There are no experts, said Morrison. So, theoretically, any student knows almost as much as any professor. It's easy to see both the up and downsides of that lack of structure. But with nothing to rebel against, Morrison found his interest in cinema waning as his love of romantic poetry blossomed. While he devoured the likes of William Blake as well as modern masters like Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac, both not exactly great fans of authority in their own right, he felt formal education was not the place for him. He would have dropped out of school to make his own way, but he was afraid that would lead to his being drafted into the war in Vietnam, a conflict in which his father played an interesting role. George Stephen Morrison had by this time risen to the rank of Rear Admiral and was serving as the commander of United States Naval Forces during the 1964 Gulf of Tonkin incident, an arguably staged incident at sea between the U.S. and North Vietnam, which was pivotal in sparking a dramatic escalation of U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. While at UCLA, Morrison met the future members of his band and the Doors were formed. They recorded a demo and found work as the house band at the famous West Hollywood nightclub Whiskey A Go Go. That gig ended unceremoniously a few months into their stint, though, when Morrison performed a song called The End, which Rolling Stone would later call explicitly edible. The Doors were never meant to be a house band, and soon they had signed to Elektra Records and released their first, self-titled album. The debut single Off the Record found only a little airplay, but their second single, Light My Fire, took the band on a rocket ride that saw the band become internationally famous while seeing Morrison become infamous. On September 17, 1967, The Doors appeared on the powerhouse variety program The Ed Sullivan Show, where Morrison was asked by a producer to edit the line, "Girl, we couldn't get much higher," from their performance because of its fairly obvious drug reference. Morrison agreed to the change, but when it came time to actually sing the song, the perpetually defiant Morrison sang it just as it was written, as he always intended to. The simple act of defiance got the Doors permanently banned from the legendary Ed Sullivan Show and planted a flag of rebellion and revolution that an entire generation would salute. Jim Morrison proved to a captivated nation that he could not be told what to do. He was true to himself at all times. To this day, Light My Fire is the Doors' most popular song and appears on practically every significant list of best rock songs ever compiled. Of course, Morrison wasn't done shocking the nation by a long shot. Over the next few years, he and his band released a stream of hit songs and records, with Morrison's personal life and on-stage antics becoming more and more erratic and scandalous. Probably not coincidentally, during this time his addictions to alcohol and drugs became increasingly uncontrollable, leading to a number of arrests and various incidents with club owners and police all over the nation. If you could in any way be thought of as an authority figure, Morrison more than likely wanted nothing to do with you. Or, more than that, what he wanted to do to you was unpleasant. Just 3 months after the Ed Sullivan appearance, an intoxicated and drug-addled Morrison got into an altercation with police and during the scuffle was sprayed in the eyes with mace. His response was to stomp onto the stage and perform an epically obscene rant that managed to set off an actual riot. It also, of course, managed to get him put in jail. After several more run-ins with the cops, including an arrest in Miami, Florida, for lewd and lascivious behavior by exposing his private parts and by simulating masturbation and oral copulation during a show, which kept him in court and off tour for most of the year, Morrison took an extended hiatus from his band and headed to Paris. The move to France was yet another example of a geographical solution to addiction which, as we know, is almost never successful. Sadly, Morrison's story is no different. On July 3, 1971, his girlfriend Pamela Corson found him dead in his bathtub. He was 27 years, 207 days old. The official cause of death was heart failure. Unofficially, 27-year-old hearts rarely fail without a lot of help from drugs and alcohol. No autopsy was performed on the body to know for sure, but more than 30 years after the fact, a Parisian club owner and friend of Morrison claimed the singer actually died of a heroin overdose inside his nightclub and was secretly transported to his apartment to hide the true cause of his demise. Why one would need to cover that up escapes me. Interestingly, so very few people ever actually saw the body before it was interned, so many still believe it was all an elaborate hoax. They believe Morrison, who was famously uncomfortable with his celebrity, faked his own death just to escape the spotlight. Unlikely as that may be, it sure sounds like a pretty decent plan to me. Officially, though, Jim Morrison was laid to rest in the storied Père Lachaise cemetery in Paris, which was established by Napoleon Bonaparte in 1804 and is the final resting place of a number of other brilliant men and women like Oscar Wilde, Molière, and Frédéric Chopin. Still today Morrison's grave is one of the most visited attractions in France, often described as second in popularity only to the Eiffel Tower. Inscribed on Morrison's tombstone, as done by his father, is the Greek phrase "kata ton daimoni itoi," which can be translated as "true to his spirit." Jim Morrison was indeed true to his spirit, and that spirit became the zeitgeist of a generation distrustful of authority, tired of being lied to and looking for something better, perhaps on the other side of perception. Morrison said that his goal as a poet and lyricist was to open the minds of his audience, to tell them to leave behind the bad old days and go in search of something new. Decades after his death, his encouragement is still found and heeded by millions who are still searching for something new, and finding it often in something old. The music of the Doors. He left us far too soon. But, while he was here, he lit a fire. Jimi Hendrix, Foxcatcher. Bar rooms and concert hall green rooms have played host to thousands, probably millions of debates on just who exactly is the single finest guitar player to ever wield an axe, but if there's a single authority on such matters, it's probably Rolling Stone magazine, and they have made their definitive choice: the greatest guitarist of all time was Jimi Hendrix. Born as Johnny Allen Hendrix on November 27, 1942, in the fertile musical grounds of Seattle, Washington, he taught himself to play guitar by memorizing the licks of the blues greats like Muddy Waters as well as rock icons like Eddie Cochran. Interestingly, and famously, Hendrix was a lefty who, without access to a left-handed guitar, took a right-handed Stratocaster and learned to play it upside down. He had a rocky, uncertain childhood. His teenage mother left the family soon after his brothers were born, and Hendrix sometimes was relegated to living with friends and relatives. He would barely ever connect with his mother throughout his short life. After dropping out of high school, Hendrix joined the United States Army in 1961. He wasn't exactly drafted, but he didn't exactly volunteer. He got into a little trouble with the law over a little spot of Grand Theft Auto, and the presiding judge gave Hendrix a choice: he could do a 2-year stint in prison, or he could enlist. He was assigned to the 101st Airborne Division and, after paratrooper training at Fort Ord in California, he was stationed at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. As you might expect from a rock and roll legend, Hendrix and the Army didn't really see eye to eye. He habitually slept while on duty, likely in part because he was usually out of his barracks and missed the mandatory midnight bed checks. An ankle injury sustained during a jump was all the excuse his commanding officer needed to honorably discharge Hendrix only 1 year into a 3-year contract. Hendrix would spend the next several years playing coffee houses and working as a fairly successful studio musician until Chas Chandler, he of the British band The Animals, took Hendrix to London in the fall of 1966 and changed rock and roll forever when he built a band called the Jimi Hendrix Experience. The new band, and their first record Are You Experienced, were an instant smash in the UK, eventually making their way back to America with a little help from Paul McCartney, he of the little-known band The Beatles. The next 3 years were the stuff of legend. Epic performances, guitars set on fire, guitars played with his teeth, and that incredible rendition of the Star Spangled Banner at Woodstock, perhaps the single most iconic moment of the single most iconic concert ever played. Hendrix seemed uniquely able to channel the 1960s into every single riff and power chord that effortlessly sprang from his instrument into the minds and souls of a generation. To put it lightly, Jimi Hendrix could play. He could play like no one ever had, or ever would, until, of course, One day he could play no more. That day was September 18, 1970. The night before his death, Jimi Hendrix attended a party with a group of friends. And his girlfriend, a German figure skater named Monika den. They retired to her apartment in Notting Hill, a cosmopolitan district in central London, where they stayed for the night. Hendrix had consumed a significant amount of red wine at the party and unwisely mixed the alcohol with an incredible amount of a sleeping medication called Vesprax. He took 9 tablets, accounting for 20 times the amount a doctor would normally prescribe for a patient. He choked on his own vomit and died in the early morning hours. He was 27 years, 295 days old. Hendrix was known to drink and experiment with drugs, sometimes even recklessly, particularly marijuana, amphetamines and LSD, but he was not known to be routinely out of control or desperately addicted. It would seem he was just an unbelievably talented man who made a really bad decision with sleeping pills and red wine one night. Unless of course you are given to conspiracy theories. Some people claim he ended his life on purpose. He had been in a fairly bad way in the weeks leading up to his death. He was at odds with his management and his record company. He was embroiled in a number of legal battles, which threatened his financial security, and he was exhausted from a relentless tour schedule. It's unlikely that he wanted to end it all, but not entirely unthinkable. Suicide, after all, is not a rational act. If you prefer to get even more wild and unsubstantiated, though, some people claim it was good old-fashioned murder. The murder theory goes like this: Hendrix's manager, Michael Jeffrey, was plagued by debt and, with his contract coming to an end that year, and with various conflicts between himself and his star, he was afraid Hendrix would soon dump him, so he decided to cash in on a life insurance policy he had taken out on his luminary that was in excess of $1 million. The theories say that not only was Jeffrey dishonest and treacherous, he had pressured Hendrix into excessive touring and was stealing the majority of the profits. Yet no one would stand up to the manager because he was rumored to have ties to British spy agency MI6, the American FBI and, to complete the trifecta, the Mafia. Whether or not there is any evidence to support these claims, there does seem to be evidence that Hendrix believed them to be true. Or at least believed Jeffrey to be a scary guy. A year before his death, Hendrix reported that he had been kidnapped and held captive for several days, only to be saved not by the police, but by Michael Jeffrey. This, Hendrix believed, was not an act of heroism, but was in fact a convoluted plot by Jeffrey to make Hendrix feel indebted and dependent on his manager. So, in a last-ditch effort to make money off of his star, Jeffrey forced toxic levels of red wine and sleeping pills down his throat, killing him. There are a number of problems with this theory, not the least of which is that Jeffrey seems to have almost certainly been in Spain when Jimi Hendrix died. But the theories persist, helped along more than a little by one of Hendrix's roadies claiming that Jeffrey actually admitted to the murder years later, saying, "I had to do it. Jimmy was worth much more to me dead than alive. That son of a bitch was going to leave me. If I lost him, I'd lose everything." Regardless of whether or not what happened that night was a crime, it was a tragic loss of one of the most gifted and most electric musicians the world has ever known. Janis Joplin, she went her own way. Janis Joplin's short, messy, often brilliant life was a study in duality and dichotomy. She was from Texas, the reddest of the red states, who tried many times to find her way in San Francisco, perhaps the most fiercely liberal city in the United States. She was a lady in the male-dominated field of rock and roll. She was a white lady singing the blues. She came into this world on the 19th day of the first month, 1943, on the shores of Sabina Lake in Port Arthur, Texas. A quiet small town with significant connections to big oil. Joplin was probably as close to wholesome as human children get, nurturing her love for music by singing in the church choir and generally being sweet and likable. But, as it does for so many of us, Joplin's teenage years changed the game and she started demonstrating her unwillingness to be tamed, a trait that would make her personal life as famous as her music. Once popular, she began to shun the cool kids at her school and follow her own paths, with road markers laid by the Beat Generation's men like Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg, who routinely turned their backs on traditional norms in favor of creativity and individuality. This led to a number of conflicts and hurtful nicknames, as well as rumors of promiscuity being spread through her school, which served to fuel the fire in Joplin's belly, telling her to get the heck out of Texas. Before she graduated, Joplin had already hard-earned a reputation as a brazen, powerful lady, given to extreme behavior and tremendous drinking. In her one semester at her first college, she focused more on expanding her talents for drinking than for learning or singing. A transfer to Port Arthur College was perhaps the quintessential wild child's first attempt at turning her back on her nature. There she primarily enrolled in secretarial courses, but Janis Joplin was no more a secretary than your receptionist is a rock star, and she was soon on her way to California to sing folk and blues in bars and clubs. Mostly, though, she drew unemployment for as long as she could before returning to Port Arthur. This time she landed at her third college, the University of Texas in Austin, where she made art her new focus. Here she also often performed at unstructured get-togethers called folksinks, where her powerful, fearless vocals amazed audiences that had never heard anything like this from a white lady. Just a few months after enrolling, though, she dumped this school, too, and traveled back to San Francisco, this time with a friend named Chet Helms. But this journey to the West proved just as fruitless as the first, and she soon crossed the continent to try her luck in New York City. By this time, though, her alcoholism was in full swing and she had added regular drug use, particularly amphetamines, to the mix. It was a toxic mixture, as it usually is, that dashed her dreams and once again sent her back to Texas. Once she was back home, and this time with at least some level of understanding of the demons of addiction on her heels, she tied her signature wild hair up in a bun, adopted the wardrobe of the secretary she never was, and put music and partying behind her. If this had taken, she might still be alive today. She might be a very successful real estate agent with a husband and 2.5 kids, but it wasn't in her. There is, of course, nothing at all wrong with living a normal life, but it was never going to work for Janis Joplin. Soon she was back in San Francisco for the third time and auditioning for a psychedelic rock band named Big Brother and the Holding Company, which was embedded in the newly exciting SF music scene, which was just beginning, and just starting to nurture another local band called the Grateful Dead. Big Brother, not coincidentally, was at that time being managed by Joplin's old friend Chet Helms. Joplin made an outstanding impression and she was asked to join the band in a relatively minor role. They wanted her for occasional vocals and backing tambourine, but her powerhouse sound and unapologetic sexuality, the brazenness of which was at least in part the result of the heroin, whiskey and speed she consumed before and during shows, proved to be all that audiences wanted to see from Big Brother. This caused more than a little friction inside the band. Though their record called Cheap Thrills was extremely successful, the process of recording it further strained the band, and Joplin quickly started to feel, with more than a little regret, the group that rescued her from that normal life was little more than an albatross around her neck. Joplin, once again, felt she needed to go her own way, so she left Big Brother and tried her luck as a solo artist. She toured relentlessly, including an astounding set at Woodstock, and made a number of high-profile television appearances with Tom Jones, Dick Cavett, and Ed Sullivan. Unfortunately, as her fame grew, so did her addictions, and she became held more and more deeply under the spells of alcohol and drugs. On the fourth day of the 10th month, 1970, in her room at the Landmark Hotel in Hollywood, California, Janis Joplin's heroin addiction got the best of her and she passed quietly away. She was 27 years, 258 days old. But as she left the earth, she moved into legend. Her album Pearl, her nickname, was released after her death and became by far her biggest hit and contained her most iconic song Me and Bobby McGee. That song, the sound with which Joplin is most closely associated to this very day, and written for her by her former lover Chris Christopherson, is a haunting sketch of a love affair told through the lens of the blues as filtered through Texas and San Francisco. A nearly impossible thing to imagine, much less perform, and yet she made it real, and with it seemed to place the spirit of herself and her generation in a bottle. Music journalist Ellen Wills encapsulated Joplin's legacy as thus: among American rock performers, she was second only to Bob Dylan in importance as a creator-recorder embodiment of her generation's mythology. That's not bad by any standard, and the legend of Janis Joplin continues to grow even today. Perhaps even more important than the shelter her music still offers to people walking in her footsteps these days is the shelter her former home offers to those who, like the icon, have misstepped along the way. Her house in San Francisco's famed Haight District was, in 1999, converted into a rehabilitation facility for drug and alcohol addiction. Her life does and should shine as a beacon of what can be achieved when one has the guts to walk their own path, but her death should serve as a warning of the dangers of losing one's way along that road. Brian Jones, Gathering No Moss. If there is any music group in history that is routinely placed against the legendary Beatles as possibly, even remotely, having a claim on being the best there's ever been, it is the Rolling Stones. But while, over the many, many years that the Stones have brought their signature brand of rock to the people, Mick Jagger and the seemingly immortal Keith Richards have dominated the minds and hearts of the band, there was another founding member by the name of Brian Jones. He left both the musical group and the world rather unexpectedly and all too soon, but without him there would likely be no Ruby Tuesday. There would be no Painted Black, there would, quite simply, be no Stones. On the occasion of Jones' death, Rolling Stone magazine wrote, "If Keith Richards and Mick Jagger were the mind and body of the Rolling Stones, Brian Jones, standing most of the time in the shadows, was clearly the soul." Brian Jones was born under the moniker Louis Brian Hopkin Jones on February 28, 1944 in Cheltenham in Gloucestershire County, England, about 2 hours' drive from London. His parents were both relatively musical, and more than a little comfortable financially, but Jones taught himself to play guitar on a Spanish axe he bought himself for a whopping investment of £3, which works out to around $7 US. It was surely for the best that he was an autodidact because, like many geniuses and most rock icons, especially from the 60s, he did not do well with authority. Jones was once suspended from Cheltenham Grammar School, like an elementary school only more British, for sparking an insurrection against the school prefects, a disciplinarian, only even more British. If you're leading rebellions before you can drive or shave, there's a fair chance you're going to be great someday. Heck, there's a fair chance you already are. Before he was even in high school, Jones had mastered a number of other instruments including the piano, clarinet, saxophone, and harmonica. Though he was described as incredibly bright, he was not very motivated as a scholar and also, like many if not most rock idols, he dropped out of school and left home while still in his teens. In his case, his exodus followed quickly on the heels of a scandal that saw him father a child, a baby boy, with his 14-year-old girlfriend. The child was adopted shortly after birth. Following school he took an ill-advised and short-lived trip to Scandinavia, but soon returned to the UK where he would work a number of odd jobs. He was a truck driver ferrying coal through the streets of Cheltenham at one point and, shortly thereafter, worked at a record shop where he admonished his customers for their terrible taste in music and tried, unsuccessfully, to convert them to fans of early American R&B and blues players. By 1962, though, he had saved up a little cash and set out on the 2-hour trip to London that would change the face of music forever. Once in the big city, he found himself frequenting a local pub called the Bricklayer's Arms. It was in that fateful bar that Mick Jagger and Keith Richards often met to sort out their futures in an R&B group and, of course, once Jones was in the mix, it was in that bar that the Rolling Stones were born. With the slightly older, more accomplished, and perhaps more hedonistic Jones acting as the band leader and de facto manager, and with more than a little help in the recording studio from the likes of Paul McCartney and John Lennon, the Stones, well, began to roll. But while fans were becoming more and more enthusiastic about the young musicians, the press, and the elder statesmen of the creative community were becoming more and more abusive. Young musicians tend to have to fight for their position in a new world order of sound, which often means displacing the previous generation as well as the men and women who wrote about their music. Music they could wrap their head around. In the 60s, the fight was often an all-out war, with the straight-laced establishment completely shocked and unable to understand the long-haired, defiant new guard and the electric clangs of their instruments. For whatever reason, the defense of the Rolling Stones and, to a certain degree, the shifting landscape of popular culture, seemed to fall squarely on Jones' shoulders. The Stones were dismissed as nonsense, called a host of names and met with the anger that almost always follows on the heels of revolutions and fear of the unknown. Jones once said about the recalcitrant press, "These ruddy reporters don't seem to want to take us seriously. Well, that's okay. We'll make them eat their lousy words one day." And in response to being called names in the papers, he offered, "Intolerant bunch. We're getting it all the time, but we'll never change. It's that lot across there who are the troublemakers. They're the ones who lack politeness and they've got no excuse. They're old enough to know better." Jones, and through him the Rolling Stones, repeatedly promised to never change. Sadly for Jones, that also included never changing his drinking and drug habits, which, even before he formed one of the most seminal bands in history, was already out of hand. With interpersonal relationships within the legendary group strained, especially after Keith Richards seduced Jones' girlfriend Anita Pallenberg on a trip to Morocco, Jones became increasingly distant and more dependent on mind and mood-altering substances. While drugs and alcohol were not strangers to any of the Stones, it seemed to damaged Jones' ability to be a productive member of the band more than most. On June 8, 1969, after his second arrest for narcotics possession, with the band preparing to tour in support of their new record Beggar's Banquet, Jones was asked to leave the band he had created. Less than a single month later, on July 3, 1969, Brian Jones was found dead, drowned at the bottom of the swimming pool of his country home in East Sussex, England. He was 27 years, 125 days old. His death was ruled an accident, the result of the terrible and tragic decision to mix drugs, alcohol, and swimming. But while that combination is so very often a deadly cocktail, that hasn't stopped Jones's death from becoming one of the most persistently perplexing tragedies in rock and roll history. The exact circumstances of his passing have been pored over, with various theories of accidental death as a result of roughhousing and even murder at the hands of an unscrupulous construction worker who was renovating Jones' estate. This theory, which has persevered for decades, goes that Jones and the builder, a man by the name of Frank Thorogood, had been at odds, with Thorogood claiming he was owed money and Jones claiming that Thorogood was trying to swindle him, inflating his bills and delaying work to raise his fees. Some believed that the confrontation came to a head and Thorogood held Jones' head underwater until he expired. This theory was never really inspected by the police, but certainly gained a great deal of traction when music writer Jeffrey Giuliano, in his book Painted Black, reported that Thorogood had made a deathbed confession to the murderous act shortly before passing away in 1993. According to Giuliano, Thorogood called a friend and admitted, "It was me that did Brian. I just finally snapped. It just happened." What really happened that night may never be known. What is known for sure is that without Brian Jones, there would have been no Rolling Stones. He gave the band their start, shepherded them through the early days, and, with the help of his relentless musicianship and mastery of so many instruments, pushed the Stones away from their R&B roots and toward the iconoclastic rock heroes they became. He even gave Mick Jagger his signature dance moves. Just 48 hours after his passing, the remaining members of the Rolling Stones held a free concert in Hyde Park where, before a staggering crowd of 250,000 people, they paid tribute to and eulogized their friend. Jagger dedicated a reading of Percy Bysshe Shelley's Adonais to Jones saying, "He is not dead, he does not sleep, he has awakened from the dream of life." Ron Pigpen McKernan, Shine On. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame called the Grateful Dead, the most important band of the psychedelic era and among the most groundbreaking acts in rock and roll history. No small praise from an organization whose only purpose is to know what it's talking about when it comes to matters such as these. But while the single most iconic image of the Grateful Dead is almost certainly the bearded, bespectacled leading man Jerry Garcia, and the second most popular image is probably a series of colorful cartoon bears, the Dead would never have happened without a disheveled man called Pigpen, who, to many if not most fans, served as the true heart and soul of the band in their most nascent days. Ronald Charles McKernan was born September 8, 1945 in San Bruno, California, to a father who worked as a disc jockey, spinning rhythm and blues records. He earned the nickname Pigpen after the Peanuts comic strip character of the same name, because of what his official Grateful Dead website biography politely calls his funky approach to life and sanitation. As a very young man, McKernan taught himself to play piano, particularly the blues. Unfortunately, he also taught himself to drink in excess, starting his binging at the age of 12. After dropping out of high school, McKernan began hanging around coffee houses and record stores in Palo Alto, California, where he met a few like-minded, literary, musical hippies, including the future Captain Trips himself, Jerry Garcia, who was offering guitar lessons at Dana Morgan's music store. McKernan was a serious student of the blues and impressed Garcia with his skill and style. Pigpen decided they should start a group, and together with Bob Weir, they formed, of all things, a jug band called Uptown Jug Champions. The Jug Band became a strings band and, soon, as a result of having been influenced heavily by a motley gang of rock and rollers from across the pond by the name of the Rolling Stones, Pigpen lobbied for the band to go electric. McKernan's undying affection of proper blues, as instilled in him from a very young age by his father, was really the driving force in the early days of the band that would become the Grateful Dead. His vocals, organ, and harmonica oozed soul, and along with his superlative musicianship, provided a great deal of legitimacy to the young group. The Dead were given to fits of outrageous experimentation and musical wanderings, but Pigpen's influence always managed to keep them all rooted in a strong foundation of the blues. Around this time, he also had a brief romance with fellow musician, and fellow 27 Club member, Janis Joplin. But the drinking never stopped, never really slowed down. It is said of McKernan that the only thing he loved more than the blues was alcohol. While the rest of the Dead's lineup would dig so deeply into the LSD-fueled psychedelic culture of the day that they basically served as the mascot of acid trips, Pigpen didn't care for tripping and stuck to his drinks. Many would probably argue that the legal, socially acceptable consumption of alcohol is far more reasonable than tripping on acid, but for Pigpen booze was a death sentence. In 1970, at only 25 years old, Pigpen was already showing signs of cirrhosis of the liver, ulcers, and a number of other drinking-related health problems. Pigpen's doctors insisted that he take an indefinite hiatus from touring with his band, and he heeded their warnings for a while. But he couldn't stay away from that one thing that really drove him, and he rejoined the band in the latter half of 1971. But by the time the Dead embarked on their fabled Europe 72 tour, his health took a terrible turn for the worse, and he had to step back from his band once again. On March 8, 1973, Pigpen's body simply couldn't handle the decades of punishment he had put himself through. Not a sudden or unexpected event from a single night of poor decisions like most of the tragic deaths in this book, he just pushed himself too far for too long. He died alone in his apartment overlooking the serene San Francisco Bay of internal hemorrhaging caused by prolonged alcohol abuse. He was 27 years, 181 days old. Peculiarly, including Ron Pigpen McKernan, fully four of the Grateful Dead's keyboard players, Keith Gottscho, Brent Midland, and Vince Welnick, all died tragically young. While our bodies are fragile and entirely transient, the soul of Pigpen McKernan, which was the soul of the Grateful Dead, will never perish, as his voice and his piano continue to echo through the hearts and minds of people everywhere. The Grateful Dead were and continue to be transformative figures who changed not only music, but the very perceptions of generations of listeners. If there was a single showcase for Pigpen amongst the Dead's set, it was surely his show-stopping rendition of Turn On Your Love Light. The song is a lament from the broken-hearted, a condition in which McKernan's passing left so many of his millions of fans, all of whom might have wanted, just one more time, to ask Pigpen to turn on your lights, let it shine on me, shine on your love light slash. Let it shine on me, let shine, let it shine, let it shine. Robert Johnson, At the Crossroads. For the purpose of this book, we're looking at brilliant men and women whose own actions led directly to their death. Does that constitute suicide? Is being reckless with drugs and alcohol significantly different than being reckless with firearms or a car? Dictionaries, among others, would argue that the difference is intent, and that's certainly a fair point as well as a rather broad line. Intent always matters. So is it suicide or simply misadventure, as coroners so often call it if one doesn't mean to end one's life? And where on that spectrum do you fall? If you die very, very young from a deal with the devil? In this particular case we're not speaking metaphorically, as in the idea that someone who gets addicted to heroin has made a deal with the devil. The devil, in this case, of course, is heroin. The deal is that it will make you feel a certain way and, in exchange, ruin your life until it kills you. Not this time. In the case of Robert Johnson, we're discussing an actual deal with an actual fallen angel. Robert Johnson was born on May 8, 1911, in Hazelhurst, Mississippi. He would record a grand total of 29 songs over the course of his terribly brief life. And, eventually, though unhappily not in his lifetime, those songs would cement him as one the greatest, maybe even the single greatest blues musician of all time. That is really about as far as the facts will take us in this chapter. Almost everything else related to Robert Johnson is, in the words of world heavyweight filmmaker Martin Scorsese, pure legend. At least as far as we know. Maybe it's all true. Anything is possible, right? And beyond a handful of grainy, turn of the century photographs and terribly few recordings, we can verify as certain truth almost nothing about the man who gave us several of the blues standards that are played non-stop still today. There is a philosophy many ascribe to that says that, in the end, all we really are, all any of us really are stories. Is Robin Hood any less real in the 21st century than Julius Caesar? One was certainly a real person and the other was almost certainly not. But, today, they're both pretty great stories. And for pretty great stories, it's hard to do much better than Robert Johnson. The legend goes like this. Robert Johnson grew up on a plantation in the Mississippi Delta and became a relatively decent harmonica player who could clear a room with his incredibly awful guitar licks. Son House, a brilliant and storied blues artist in his own right, recalled during an interview for the documentary Can't You Hear the Wind Howl, that Johnson would pester the older musicians in the community for an opportunity to sit in with them during gigs. Sometimes those older guys would take pity on the young man and audiences would, in turn, complain vociferously. House remembered, folks they come and say, why don't you go out and make that boy put that thing down? He running us crazy. Eventually, when enough people asked Johnson to leave, he did. He left behind his mother and his father and took off for, as House put it, Arkansas someplace or other. Just a few weeks later, though, Johnson turned up again, only now he was perhaps the best guitar player of his era. This assessment was not just an idle observation. Rolling Stone magazine went as far as to name him the 5th best guitarist of all time. Johnson said he had just been studying with a normal human teacher, but the people who heard him play before and after didn't seem to buy it. To play like that, especially so quickly, they said, he must have sold his soul. The legend is more specific about the logistics of the whole thing. It says that Johnson took his guitar to the crossroads of highways 49 and 61 on a moonless night, where he made a deal with the devil, an offer of insane guitar skills in exchange for his soul. After his return, Johnson traveled to a few places, playing in bars and on street corners and, for which we can all be grateful, had the opportunity to record his music twice. But not long after his supposed Crossroads deal, just before learning that Columbia Records' famous talent scout John Hammond was looking to hire him to play at Carnegie Hall for the momentous Spirituals to Swing concert of 1938, Robert Johnson died. He was 27 years, 100 days old. Much like almost every aspect of the enigmatic bluesman's life, his death is shrouded in mystery. On the night of Saturday, August 13, 1938, Robert Johnson was playing in a juke joint, a primarily Southern American dancing, music and gambling hall, on the outskirts of Greenwood, Mississippi when he fell ill and was taken to a nearby friend's house. 3 days of terrible sickness followed until the legend passed on. Some say he was poisoned by a jar of strychnine-laced whiskey delivered by a jealous bar owner whose girlfriend had been flirting with the guitar player. Others say it was indeed poisoned whiskey, but it was the girl herself who did the poisoning, jealous of him for seeing a number of other women besides her. In Johnson's own mother's words, some wicked girl or her boyfriend had given him poison and wasn't no doctor in the world could save him, so they say. The official cause of death was, it is said, marked down to complications from syphilis. While that option is considerably less murderous than poisoned whiskey, it is still likely a result of his complicated relationships with women. But, of course, many just think that on that night the devil took his due. Once again, according to his mother, in his final moments Johnson was lying in bed with his guitar lying across his chest. He had held on long enough for her to make it to his bedside and said to her, "Mama, you all I been waitin' for." "Here," he said, handing her his guitar. "Take and hang this thing on the wall, 'cause I done pass all that by. That what got me messed up, Mama. It's the devil's instrument, just like you said. And I don't want it no more." As his mother was hanging the guitar on the wall, Robert Johnson passed away. Is the story of the source of his fierce talent and the story of his tragic death outlandish? Sure. Is it almost certainly just a legend without an ounce of fact to be found anywhere? Probably. But it sure is a good story, and who could really ask it to become anything more than that? Jonathan Brandis, born famous, but at what cost? Almost every member of the tragic 27 Club is a musician, but other artists are not immune from membership in the terrible guild, as this chapter clearly illustrates. Jonathan Gregory Brandis was born April 13, 1976 in Danbury, Connecticut, roughly 70 miles from Manhattan. An only child born to Mary Brandis, a teacher, and Gregory Brandis, a food distributor and firefighter. Brandis was, at the age of 2, modeling for Buster Brown clothes. He had one of those faces, one supposes, that can sell things. Even before he had enrolled in kindergarten, he was on the road that would lead him to fame and fortune, acting professionally in ads for Kick cereal and Fisher-Price toys. By the time he was 6, he was a commuter. I'm going to repeat that, because it's ridiculous. He was a 6-year-old with a commute to work, as he drove into New York City regularly to play a character on the long-running daytime soap opera One Life to Live. At 9 years of age, his family moved to the acting capital of the Western world, Los Angeles, California, all to try and further the young boy's career. Once in Hollywood, he quickly booked a number of high-profile stints on popular television shows like The Wonder Years, Blossom, and L.A. Law. And he was, as they say, off to the races. By 16, he was a genuine child star, perhaps even the child star of the 1990s. With leading roles in very popular films like Ladybugs and The Never Ending Story 2. but, as has been shown time and time again, a transition from child star to adult star, or even to regular, well-adjusted adult who works at the grocery store, is an almost impossible journey. His last major project and probably his most well-known role was as boy genius Lucas Wolenzak in the Steven Spielberg-produced television show Sequest. 2032. As the LA Times pointed out on the 10th anniversary of Brandis's death, you can't picture him any older than that. This, of course, is because you didn't see him after that. Because when Sequest ended its short run in 1996, he was no longer the baby-faced blonde who once learned karate with Chuck Norris in Sidekicks. He was not even 20 years old, but he was more a man than not, at least in the eyes of casting directors and, perhaps, in the eyes of audiences, and people seemed to want the boy. The major motion picture and television offers dried up. He was seen not as a star that had grown up, but as a child star who was no longer a child and, therefore, had no place. A career that had been an unstoppable rocket ride since he was literally 2 years old now seemed over. At the height of his fame, Brandis was receiving as many as 4,000 fan letters a week, basically keeping the United States Postal Service in business. When he would arrive at work during the Sequest days, 3 separate security guards were needed to shepherd him through the throng of girls waiting for him on the Universal Studios lot every single day, and in 1 year he appeared on 8 out of 10 issues of the leading teen-oriented magazine Tiger Beat. To move from, not only that level of success, but to have genuinely never even experienced anything other than success, proved difficult to say the least. Severe depression followed. Brandis worked hard to remake his image, playing as far against type as he could. When he tinted his hair jet black and took on the independent film roles of first a drug addict, and then a murderer, not only did the audiences not connect with the new, older Brandis, they didn't seem to know the movies even existed. It seems people who buy Tiger Beat can rarely be counted on to support art house cinema. Then everything ground to a halt altogether. Brandis didn't work a single day for 2 years and no one seemed to notice that, either. Then, finally, it came. The shot at comeback glory he had waited for. He landed. A part in Heart's War, a gritty big-screen World War II drama headlined by a pair of superstars, Bruce Willis and Colin Farrell. It was a proper movie with a nationwide release, big stars and, more than that, it was a World War II picture. The most consistently award-nominated genre of film. It was his ticket back, he seemed to think. But then the film was released. The fact that it was only modestly successful was one disappointment, but far worse for the one-time golden child was this. Virtually every second of his screen time was cut from the film. According to friends, Brandis took it hard. Shortly afterward, just before midnight on November 11, 2003, Jonathan Brandis hanged himself in his apartment in Los Angeles. He was 27 years, 222 days old. One can't help but wonder if he would still be alive today if he had never appeared on camera. If he grew up kind of weird looking, instead of being boyishly handsome, and no one ever tried to convince him to be famous, would he still be here? Most people aren't on the cover of teen magazines, most people aren't fawned over their whole lives, and so, when their luck goes the other way, most people don't feel washed up and over the hill in their mid-20s. Heck, in this day and age, most people haven't even started up the darn hill in their mid-20s. But he never had a chance to figure out his path, he just walked it, beginning even before he could walk. If Hollywood had never come calling, if he hadn't been the first crush of an Entire generation of women who probably hung his posters on their walls as children but don't remember his name today. Would he have crashed so hard? Or would he be a perfectly happy banker and football coach in a normal suburban town? And would he have wanted that? Would he have rather had 20 years in the sun than 80 in the shade of suburban Connecticut? It's impossible to say, of course. And it's no one's fault, I don't think. But most actors face a decade or so of rejection before their career ever begins, and, for better or worse, when things go the other way, as they often do for stars and the rest of us alike, they have a skill set that a man who was acting professionally while in diapers likely never had an opportunity to develop. And while having thousands upon thousands of young women screaming your name when you walk into work might be the dream of a great deal of young men, one is forced to wonder about the cost of that level of celebrity at that age. It's hard not to feel like a whole, innocent human being was plucked out of New England just because he had the kind of face that sells magazines, that he was given the world on a silver platter for the first 2 decades of his life, and then, when he wasn't a child anymore, he was discarded, because all of those screaming girls became reasonable women with jobs and daughters of their own, who are screaming now for some other poor boy who doesn't realize how unlucky he is. Kurt Cobain, as I want you to be. When I heard the news that Kurt Cobain had passed away, told to me by the inimitable Kurt Loder with his trademark robot voice slightly cracking under the weight of tragedy, the world seemed like it immediately got a whole lot worse. I was 18 and Kitz wasn't just the voice of my generation, an accolade he disdained despite its obvious, cumbersome truth. It was the voice that made me fall in love with music. It seemed like all of the potential energy of an entire era was distilled and concentrated into a single, cardigan-encased body, and now that potential was just gone. It felt like a personal loss because Kurt Cobain felt like he was an actual part of each of us. He was our vocal cords, he was our weariness, our vanguard, our poet and our muse. He was Generation X personified bright as the sun. He was not a product of the 1990s so much as the 1990s were a product of him. Is that an insane amount of pressure to put on a single, sensitive, fragile human? Of course, it is. But my whole generation put that on him all the same. We never felt like we had a choice. On February 20, 1967, in Aberdeen, Washington, a storm was born into a hurricane. Kurt Donald Cobain was a talented artist from an early age who gravitated to drawing and piano, playing and singing by the time he was 4, as his parents were drawn to angrier and angrier fights with one another. Cobain's extended family was musical, his uncle was in a band and his great uncle was a great tenor who was featured in the 1930 movie King of Jazz. His immediate family was less so. Cobain's father was a mechanic and his mother was a housewife, and, perhaps most importantly from the young genius's perspective, they did not get along well at all. Cobain's parents finally divorced when he was 9, and he mostly lived with his father, who quickly remarried. Cobain did not care for his stepmother or her children and became more and more solitary, feeling like his father preferred his new family. He felt he was alone adrift on a sea of people who didn't care for him, but whom he could not escape. Then when he was 14, Cobain's uncle Chuck gave him a life raft, a guitar. It was beat up and well past its best days, but it played well enough to spark the fire that would someday burn the 80s to the ground. He taught himself some basic rock and roll songs and, in his acts, felt sheltered. But every silver lining has a cloud, and Cobain was bullied at school for shunning athletics in favor of art. It got to the point that he felt he needed to drop out. It was shortly after that, while hanging out with a local band called the Melvins, that Kurt met and became close friends with a young bass player named Krist Novoselic, and together they started a little band called Nirvana that would change the course of music history. With Chad Channing on drums, Nirvana released its first album, Bleach, in 1989. Through the indie Seattle label Sub Pop. The record was only a minor success. But their popularity in the rapidly expanding Seattle music scene began to blossom, and their approach to pop through distorted punk melodies and clanging metal guitars was already present. Soon, with a new drummer on board, in the crazy talented Dave Grohl, Nirvana was signed to a major label with DGC. And, in 1991, the trio would shake the rock world to rubble and rebuild it in the band's own sound, with the release of the epic and transformative Nevermind. Nevermind didn't just hit, it changed the whole music game. It was the death knell for hair bands and 80s pop bands the world over, and could very easily be called the single most important album ever produced. But with the colossal success of that record came colossal fame, a condition in which Kurt Cobain could never find comfort or peace. He made great efforts to utilize his fame to support and speak out for the rights of women, gays, and nonconformists like himself, while redirecting his own growing rage and frustration into his albums, but he chose to deal with his discomfort in less productive ways as well. As early as his mid-teenage years, Cobain had experimented with drugs, but by the late 80s he had begun a very serious and very destructive relationship with heroin. In 1991, he would initiate another destructive relationship that would only exacerbate the drug problem. He met and fell in love with another rock star by the name of Courtney Love. Kurt was dealing with more than just the difficulty of accepting his role as one of the most famous and sought-after people in the world. He was beset by excruciating abdominal pain, and heroin gave both his stomach and his brain an escape from the suffering. But, as is usually the case with things like heroin, it brought a cotter of other horrors with it. When Love became pregnant with the couple's first and only child, allegations that she used heroin while pregnant dogged both Cobain and his new bride, and were repeated in thousands of gossip pages and tabloids. These allegations were probably not begun, but certainly not in any way helped by the fact that Love admitted as much in the pages of the magazine Vanity Fair. Their daughter, Frances Bean Cobain, was born in August of 1992, a beautiful young lady who was quickly at the center of an investigation by social services, who worried she may be in danger if she were allowed to remain with her parents. An extended and very expensive legal fight followed, and, in the end, Cobain and Love retained custody of their child, but the battle took a heavy toll on the young couple. Nirvana continued their absolute domination of popular music with the release of their next record In Utero, with critics hailing it as the remarkable achievement that it absolutely is, and, as expected, it quickly found its way to number 1 on the charts. Cobain had not lost a single step professionally. He was without question the most gifted and important musician of the 90s, even though he would only live for less than half of the decade. But while his music continued to blister the charts with its awesomeness, personally things were going in an ugly direction. Cobain and Love's relationship was rocky to say the least. The police were forced to visit the couple's home multiple times because of domestic disturbances between the two rock stars, and guns and drugs were, on at least one occasion, removed from their house by authorities. While on tour in Italy, in the spring of 1994, Kurt Cobain attempted suicide by overdosing on heroin. His wife awoke in the early hours to find he had slipped into a coma and had him quickly rushed to a nearby hospital for treatment. Officially it was put down as an accidental overdose, but the fact that it was a suicide attempt is fairly indisputable, as he left a note. Only a few days later, now back in the States, Courtney Love held an intervention for her husband, pleading with him to put the drugs behind him for the good of himself, his marriage and his infant daughter. He agreed to get help and checked himself into Exodus Recovery Center in Los Angeles, but left the very next day. Upon leaving Exodus, he went missing for a solid week in early April. He was one of the most watched, most followed, most hounded men on the face of the planet, and no one knew where he was. Tragically, he had gone home to Seattle where, on April 5, 1994, alone in the guest house behind his Seattle home, Kurt Cobain ended his life. He was 27 years, 44 days old. The whole world, or at the very least, the entire under 30 world, mourned. His ashes were scattered into the waters of the Wishkah River. Despite a lengthy and heartbreaking suicide note left at the scene in Kit's handwriting, in the aftermath of his death, many people have come forth with various theories about what really must have happened that fateful April day. Most of these people have found ways to blame Courtney Love for a murder she almost certainly didn't commit. It's hard to find a reason for her wanting to have Kurt killed, and harder still to figure out why, if she no longer wanted her husband alive, she had tried so desperately to get him free of his addictions. For that matter, why, if she really wanted him dead, did she not just leave him in that Italian hotel room? But Cobain wasn't just loved, he was adored, and a generation of young men and women could not find a way to understand how someone who could do what he could do, who had meant so much to so many, would end his life. And Courtney Love makes a great villain. Love, outlandish, often rude and destructive, and in the opinion of popular culture not remotely in Kit's league in terms of talent, success, beauty, or any of the usual markers of awesomeness. So it's true that she made a great villain. And people need someone to blame. The real villain, the real killer, was surely pain and addiction. What we know for sure, what no one can ever deny, is that Kurt Cobain was brilliant and beloved and haunted. His legend, along with his songs, will continue on, finding new ears and new souls to liberate and inspire. He was a titan, he was one of the best of us, but he was flawed and fragile, too. Like all of us. Live. One of the greatest risks one runs when writing about celebrity deaths is messing up a single sentence, or maybe just a single piece of syntax, just enough to glamorize a horrible, terrible, tragic act. Or even if you don't mess it up, you fill the pages with how great these people were and then tell of their demise, and an impressionable person might go out and make a terrible decision. So, let me be perfectly clear here, if you are one of the greats, live. If you are not one of the greats, live. Living made these people brilliant, not dying, and certainly not dying so young, with so much left undone. If you are feeling suicidal or know someone who is, please get help. Services like the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline exist solely to help get you through tough times. Or talk to a parent, friend, partner, or counselor. Drugs and defiance do not contain the answers you seek. Nothing great comes from being dead, only from what you can do while you're alive. I don't think anyone has ever had more authority on the matter, or said it better, than Kurt Cobain's own daughter. In response to a young musician who said she idolized Cobain and Amy Winehouse and wanted to be dead, Frances Bean Cobain wrote this: "The death of young musicians isn't something to romanticize. I'll never know my father because he died young, and it becomes a Desirable feat because people like you think it's cool. Well, it's not. Embrace life, because you only get one life. The people you mentioned wasted that life. Don't be one of those people. You're too talented to waste it away. No matter who you are, no matter where you are, no matter what you do, I promise this applies to you. You are too talented to waste it away. Alexander. One more thing. I would be grateful if you took the time to leave an honest review for this book in your applicable Amazon store. Whether you loved it, hated it, or were indifferent, I appreciate you taking the time to share your opinion of it with myself and others. You can do so here.